All right, I'm going to start recording. So you were saying, what is this one business, and then that you didn't actually read up the Parmenides part because it was too small type or something.
But let me amend that by saying I infer from the Parmenides discussion that certain things were just axiomatically taken. First was some concept of creations. Everything hasn't been created because that's what we see in our life cycle world. You know, well, people are born, and let's be
careful. Let's be careful. There's no actual. There is talk of story of creation in Plato, but it's often the Timaeus. It's and it's a different character.
I have not read the Timaeus. That's another difficulty.
It's the Pythagorean stranger who Plato brings in to talk about the creation of what we would consider the visible universe, or the historical world, or the natural world, right?
Right.
The stuff in the Parmenides never mentions anything remotely like creation.
Right. Okay. But
it does mention being, but the first whole section that we read, the first hypothesis, is all about the concept of the one, and it culminates in the statement that the one has no relationship, has no being whatsoever.
Yeah, and okay, and that comes up again very, very prominently in Plotinus. So let's just stop there for a minute.
Yes.
So I have not read the Timaeus, so I'm a little bit handicapped. That's my, lifelong amateur status. But I'm
just saying the relationship between the demiurge or creator of the Timaeus and the Parmenides.
That's the Gnostic stuff.
No. There is a bunch of demiurge creator stuff in the Gnostics, but the original, person who just says the demiurge, the Greek word for the creator, is Plato's Timaeus. I'm just saying that all of that is not presented by Plato as being a Parmenidean doctrine at all. It's all presented as being a Pythagorean doctrine in a different dialogue. So people like Plotinus, coming, centuries after the event, are interested in seeing whether or not all these different things, different doctrines in Plato, line up with one another or don't. And if they do, they might start equating some of these figures or characters from different dialogues, or the doctrines of characters in different dialogues, with one another to try to make a coherent whole out of them. You certainly get a lot of that by the time of Proclus. I was going to also try to put them together with things from Aristotle even. But the point is that Plato himself never tells you that the demiurge of the Timaeus is the same as the one of the Parmenides, is the same as the good of the Republic. Any such equation is being done by people after him.
Yes, and that's what I'm pointing my finger at.
Okay, yes. Right, but just insofar as there is a one business, as you put it, that is definitely already there in Plato. It's just the one business is the Parmenides business. It's not the same thing as creation at all. It's not taking anything about creation for granted. It's taking the notion of one as simple, and then it's seeing what are the consequences of something really being so simple that it is completely one and has no manyness about it. And because it winds up being the case that all of our ways of thinking about things involve and use distinction, it's something like something which is truly one can't have any distinctions even drawn about it, and therefore we can't even think about it.
Clear.
And that's sort of the kind of argumentation that you get in the first hypothesis section of the Parmenides, which is meant to end in this sort of unbelievable aporia, right? It says you cannot know anything at all about the one, and the one doesn't even participate in being. And then he asks the young interlocutor, do you suppose that this is how things could be about the one? And he says, no, I don't suppose this is how they could be. Well, would you like to start again then, right? And he starts again, and then the next fall, right? Again, they end in a complete aporia, but all the conclusions come out differently, right?
I stand with Wittgenstein with the idea of things about which nothing can be known.
Nothing can be said, said Wittgenstein. He didn't say nothing can be known, right? But yeah, so we're talking about the unknown God and the ineffable, because that's ineffable really means what cannot be said. And the very first line, of course, the beginning is that the Tao that can be said is not the Tao, right? The Eastern version, the same idea. But yes, this one business is very much what we're on about here, and the point of this whole negative theology tradition in the Platonists is that they're pointing back to this mysterious thing coming from Parmenides, maybe from Plato, maybe from Parmenides, some mixture of the two, maybe coming from Parmenides and seemingly endorsed by Plato, unclear, with, curious as to how much is to be taken just as a logic exercise and how much is to be taken seriously. And by the time the Neoplatonists are taking it very seriously indeed, right? In the case of Plotinus, he's trying to put together with everything else he thinks about the first principles of metaphysics or the hierarchy or the divine, and he's going to come up with his own metaphysical understanding of all that, and there's going to be some consequences for how knowable or unknowable the one is in Plotinus. But fundamentally, he's agreeing with the not only the Plato of those dialogues, or trying to, but there's also a reported well after the event, public dialogue that Plato gave about the good, where he ended by saying that the good is the one, and everyone, completely didn't understand him. But that also is something that Plotinus is trying to agree with. He's trying to equate the one of the Parmenides with the good that is said to be beyond being of the Republic. And maybe the king of the first principle discussed in the second letter to Dionysius of Syracuse. So anyway, so the point is Plotinus is putting all those things together, and he's trying to come up with a coherent Platonic metaphysics / theology. And it must be said, in his version of that, the least important part of it is something like demiurge in the sense of creator of the natural world in this way that you get it in the Timaeus. But he does think that this first principle is something like a first principle of all being that is even the cause of being, and therefore it's before being, and other things come after being are caused by being. So he has like a metaphysical hierarchy where the good one is at the top, and then being and mind are below it at the second level. And then the third level below that is soul or life. And it is only at the level of the last that you get to anything like something that occurring in time. Okay, so that's sort of the Platonian version of the top of the hierarchy. By the time of people like Proclus later, there's going to be a lot more equating of that notion of God with that notion of the one with a God, and that notion of the God with the creator of the Timaeus. In part under the pressure of competition with Christianity, so to speak, but also for internal reasons, so to speak. Okay, but that's just the broadest sketch of this one business, and the one business. It's 350 years, well, it's probably 400 or 500 years old before Christianity, and Proclus is 480 years after, birth of Christ. So this is a tradition that is spanning 1,000 years of paganism. Okay. Sorry, I see we got Sam joining us. We normally do a bunch of rounds of introduction, who did the reading kind of questions, which we kind of skipped over because we were jumping in with a question that Joe had. So, we already started recording. Right, so anyone who doesn't know, reading this book, we're on our third session on this. Second session on this. And we've previously did all this stuff down to Plotinus in Platonism before Plotinus, and now we're doing Neoplatonism, chapters 5 and 6 of this book. So that's Plotinus and, as she puts it, later Neoplatonic apophasis or negative theology, of which there's like one short section on someone other than Proclus, then everything else is Proclus. I'll talk a little bit about the intervening tissue of the bits of Neoplatonism between Plotinus and Proclus, but they're the bookends, so the important beginning and the important end, the two weightiest figures in Neoplatonism. But okay, before we get into the capsule history of Neoplatonism and answering anybody's questions about the timings and characters and all that kind of stuff, let's just do our usual round of did the reading, previous familiarity or lack thereof with any of the topics or writers here, and we'll come back for first impressions. You want to start us, Craig?
Okay, I got through the reading. These two chapters didn't seem as dense as the earlier stuff. A little bit more straightforward and laid out. I found a very important little thing to help me along when she gets into her pseudo-academic BS about putting things in Greek or Latin.
Yes.
Fortunately, she makes a reference to Plotinus. All I have to do is go to McKenna and get the English version of what she said in Greek or Latin with his translation, and that was quite a help to be able to decipher what she seems to want.
It's fair. Most of in these two chapters, almost everything she's quoting is either from Plotinus, Enneads, or Proclus's commentary on the Parmenides, and so there are some places where she quotes other people and doesn't translate them, but these two would help you translate almost everything.
Yeah, the Proclus is on order. It was like $100 on Amazon, so I ordered it through Alibris and got it down to 60 something. So it's not a cheap book by any means.
I've picked up things like this over the years at just good college bookstores. This one I think I got from the Div School Theological Seminary bookstore at University of Chicago, right? Yeah. The other bookstore that tends to have things like this is some of the used bookstores in Palo Alto around Stanford. You'll typically find them. There's probably a couple others like that, but yeah, just going to what's the latest Amazon copy of it and finding a price of $110 can be a problem with some of these more obscure things.
This I got for $35 over at Mike Riley's place there on Indian School. So I felt lucky with that. Even already had the plastic cover on everything. And so I've also started into another little interesting one, 125 pages. She's got a thing with A.H. Armstrong. So this is the architecture of the intelligible universe and the philosophy of Plotinus.
By Armstrong.
By Armstrong. It's dense, but she seems to really have a thing for Armstrong. So
no question.
So I'm kind of digging into that and such. So it was quite interesting reading. I'm looking forward to see how they bring Aristotle into it and get to Augustine, but I know that's next session. So so it left a lot of things open.
I will say that, I mean, some of these people, certainly people like Proclus, did try to assimilate a lot of these things with Aristotle, but mostly this tradition is a Platonic tradition, even when it gets into the Christian writers, and there's not a ton of influence of Aristotelianism on it. There's a few places, even the stuff we got last time, where people were thinking of the thought thinking itself version of things that was influenced by Aristotle, but and there's a little bit of that in Proclus, but mostly they think that, when I say they, most of the people in this tradition think that Aristotle's version of peak metaphysics is too simplistic and in a way rationalist for them. Doesn't have enough terms in it. It's all stuck on the mind being level, and thinks that the mind being level is the top of the hierarchy. We could talk about that when we get to the different people's versions of this hierarchy, but in terms of the reaction to the chapter, and we'll get to first reactions in a second, but I did have one question, because you said it seemed more straightforward than some of the others. There's certainly fewer characters in it. Did you find it at all repetitious, or was it, do you find that she's saying the same thing over and over, is what I'm asking?
Yeah, somewhat, but at the same time, Plotinus sort of was saying the same thing over and over a little bit.
I noticed that, for example, there's places where she says, is Plotinus original here? And this is what's original in Plotinus. And this is where he anticipates, Dionysus. And this is where he has a parallel in Gregory of Nyssa. He's going to have another chapter on that later on, right? But she's sort of, saying this person said this, and this person said this, and this person said this, and the thing they're saying is the same thing, right? And she's saying it in every chapter where any of them occur.
and it seemed like there was one place I didn't want to take the effort to try and sort it out, but it's one place where she almost repeated a paragraph verbatim. So So
I didn't notice that repeated verbatim. I'm just noticing that, especially in some of these negative, you can't know anything about the one kind of statements, she's often giving the statement from the current subject of the chapter, and then saying, and this anticipates this other person who said the same thing, and this other person who said the same thing, and harks back to this other person who said the same thing, and so that can get a little repetitious. But anyway, fine. Did the reading previous acquaintance, is this new for all this stuff new for you, or?
Well, we've done some stuff on Plotinus a while back.
We did, yes.
when I got the book. And
Okay.
So it was kind of
That's
coming back to me in a sense, but
okay.
But a little, quite a bit of Proclus was sort of new.
Yep.
I look forward to getting the Proclus Parmenides
okay.
book that you held up there. And
Yep.
So
there's a couple of the Procluses that are worth reading. I mean, this is a shorter one. This is on basically providence and problem of evil kind of questions. It's a very small book.
Yeah.
And then the other one that is the theology of Plato and elements of theology. And
that one I have. Yeah, that one I have. I got it the last time we were studying them. So
yeah.
So this is a return, and the only other thing, like I say, I'm looking forward to getting to Augustine, and then looking back on how we get the jump to Aquinas. So
okay, yeah, I mean Aquinas is not going to come up in this book at all, but
obviously not.
We can think about all of these people as the kind of before the high medieval scholastics as background to what Christian theology was like in the West before not only Aquinas, but even before the age of people like Bonaventura. Okay, Joe, did you do the reading? I think it's all new to you. I think got most of this reaction, but do you have more to say on any of that?
I did all the pages, and did them recently, so they're fresh in mind.
Yep.
But I did do them all.
Yep. And it's all new to you or stuff?
It's all new to me. The only part about it that I known in the past are a few of the names, like I knew the name Plautus, but my knowledge that I knew nothing. And Proclus, I'd heard that and knew I knew nothing. Then there were other new names, of course. Since the Gnostic book was so recent, I was always looking for Gnostic influences in every one of these things, or at least some kind of underlying influence on both the Gnostic point of view and this point of view. Anyway, I was alert to that. I didn't really find it, but I was very alert to it. And the creation thing was one thing that left out as focusing my attention, since I personally don't believe in such shit.
Yeah.
And the creator stuff, but I was wondering, where did this come from? Is it a natural human urge because the caveman sees the thunder and thinks God did it, and he just invents a human in his own image to cast something fiery? I mean,
we're certainly not going to get through every possible theory of the origin of religion here, but
I understand.
But on the issue of the Gnostic parallels, there are some. I mean, I realize you said they might be subtle. They're not direct influences in the sense of someone is citing Valentinius as his a source on something or anything like that. But there are definitely points in common that can, if I can put it this way, throw some philosophical / rational light on some things that might have been mysterious in the Gnostics. For example, the doctrine that at first the highest God was alone with silence, right? Especially because as they're getting to in these methods of reunion, there's a way in which the adepts, or philosophers' quest to know the truth is going backwards through the chain of the supposed emanations of creation. So you've got, if this is the cause and it's created all these layers afterwards, you traverse the layers in reverse order to get back to the origin. And all of these things saying eventually you get to what cannot be understood, and the only recourse is silence, right? Is saying something like you only get back to the original unity when the only companion of that original unity is silence. And that's echoing something that was already there in Valentinius. Valentinius didn't give you anything like this reason for it, but here we see a bunch of the reasons for it and why that would be there. So there's more continuity there at the level of the thought behind the myth, so to speak, that might have been apparent when you were just seeing it as a bare doctrine in Valentinius.
Right. Well, another point that sort of hooked in there, but I didn't understand it. In previous readings that we discussed in these conference meetings, I always look at the footnotes, and when they simply cite a book or with a page, I've learned nothing. Sometimes they will translate something. Sometimes they'll give more explanation. I've often seen the name Valentinius cited in things that we've been reading before. Now, that the Gnostic stuff, that's clear because
that's
I actually saw Valentinius cited often. I think often enough for me to remember. And I wondered who the hell was that? Was that an early church father? I assumed that, and went on.
Nope, it's not. It's Valentinius is one of the Gnostics. He's one of the
we read the chapter. We read the chapter.
One of the most important Gnostics of the 2nd century, around 150 AD in Rome. Very active there. So several of the church fathers write significant screeds against him from his time to 150 years or 200 years after his time. So he was still a live issue as a sort of Gnostic challenge to Christianity that purported to be Christianity, right? This was an interpretation of Christianity, a Gnostic interpretation of Christianity that said this is the truth of Christianity, but had all of this Gnostic metaphysics speculation at the top of it. Anyway, that's stuff we got through in Jonas before. I was just reacting to the point about, is there a Gnostic connection here? It's not that these guys are directly influenced by the Gnostics, but there are things that you find in their argumentation which would give sort of rationalist color to why a Gnostic would have come out there. There's probably a common source in that back in the Middle Platonists. Think about some of these things. And you can certainly see like parallels with people like Celsus and so forth, who was a little bit contemporary with those Gnostics, but more on the sort of pagan philosophical end of things rather than the Gnostic religious end of things. Okay, Sam, any comments on, were you able to do the reading? Have you read any of these guys before? Familiarity with it? Anything like that?
Very fleeting, maybe. Yeah, sadly I didn't read, so I'll probably just listen in. But my own interest is much more about some of the so-called supposed links between more modern thinkers and mysticism, Gnosticism, and esotericism, things like that.
Yep.
People like Hegel and Schopenhauer. And so I'm just trying to catch strands of if I can pick up any any parallels.
No, it's a fine comment.
And sadly, I also have to leave by in maybe 45 or so minutes. I'm in Texas, by the way.
Okay, well, certainly welcome. Glad you could join us, and understand if you can't stay with us the whole time. We often go on, at great length. On the Hegel connection, we'll try to get. I mean, I don't know we'll have time to get to it while you're still here, but there certainly are such parallels in Proclus in particular. Proclus has a notion of the way in which you progress through some original thing, and the thing which processes out of it, and the reversion back to the original in it as this triad of things that you have everywhere, which is very much of a piece of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis stuff that you get in Hegel. The modern version of that was actually probably invented by Fichte rather than Hegel, but did Fichte get it from Proclus? Possibly. Certainly in things like Hegel's Logic, that is the Science of Logic book. There's lots of things there. He's sort of recapitulating different positions in the history of thought, and the Neoplatonists definitely figure in that. And Proclus is close to some of the stuff he's doing there. So I think there are definite parallels between modern German idealist stuff, especially Hegel, and some of the stuff you find in the Neoplatonists, especially Proclus.
Great.
So, but I don't know if we're going to be able to get into all of the ways in which there are such parallels here, but you're
right.
Sure. There are some. Okay. So we normally next do first reactions, and we've gotten a little bit of them already, but Joe, you already had your what is this one business, and we probably sort of already got through that one from your first reactions, but Craig, any first reactions to this that you haven't already covered?
No, a little bit of the same thing that we talked about earlier about the repetition.
Yes.
Keep hitting it. I find she wanted to me sort of stay on topic, and once the horse was beaten dead about the ineffableness of things, there's brief mentioning of theurgy and other avenues, and then she just drops it, and as sort of not being part of her topic. So I found that was kind of interesting that she stuck to topic and briefly mentioned theurgy and some of the other more mystical approaches once you find the intellect can't get there, but she didn't spend much time on it.
Right, and we definitely have to talk about these because there's variation here, both of these guys from the Middle Platonists before, and it's these guys in themselves. I mean, Plotinus, I think she's right, comes out in a fairly mystical direction after this far, intellect can get and no farther, and after that, quiet the mind and wait for the good to appear, kind of, and that's very similar to what you get in a lot of mystical traditions. I think she says that, I think she puts it in a negative form. She says at one point, it's not entirely fair to say that Plotinus is a mystic and Proclus only has a theory of mysticism, right? But I think that's actually more fair than she gives it credit for. But Plotinus is a mystic and Proclus isn't. At least if he's a mystic, he's not the kind of mystic who convincingly gives you the impression that he's been there, which Plotinus does. But the kind of, there's a definite dividing line, which doesn't actually, well, we'll get to the history of the Neoplatonists, but basically Plotinus is on a side if he's not doing a theurgy yet, and Proclus is on the other side of the where he is, where theurgy means God working, or the idea that there's some sort of ritual practices that can be useful in achieving enlightened states, something like that. And what you don't get that in Proclus. There's nothing ritual about it. There is something mystical about it, but it's a purely intellectual mysticism. There's no ritual practice involved in it whatsoever. By the time of Proclus, that is there, but he's not the guy who put it there. It's already a tradition by the time he's talking about it. Okay. Let's talk a little about the history, just the timeline of Neoplatonism. So Plotinus is writing in around 250. He's actually born in 204, dies in like 270. He born in Egypt, but works in Rome. His student Porphyry, his name, Porphyry is actually a nom de plume. He's called Porphyry, that means, the purple, because he's from the city of Tyre where they make the purple robes. And it's also meant to say that there's something royal about his mind or something, but he was Plotinus's literary executor. He was a student of Plotinus, born in Tyre, worked in Rome, overlaps with Plotinus, born 234 and died in 305, younger than most of the rest of these. When these guys died at 70, it's young. But anyway, the Porphyry is the actual author of what we have of Plotinus. Plotinus didn't write these things down himself. He gave lectures. And what we have of him, which is the Enneads, is published by Porphyry as his remembrances of Plotinus's lectures that he, Porphyry, has reduced to, a systematic form, right? So did Plotinus, deliver these things as single addresses on, as a single composed address on one occasion or another? Probably not. This is Porphyry collecting his comments about topic A, topic B, and putting them into a coherent discourse sort of form. The actual contents of the thought, almost certainly all from Plotinus, but Porphyry is the sort of next really important Neoplatonist, and he is a disciple of Plotinus. He does disagree with him at times. Besides the Enneads, he was known in the Middle Ages for a book called Isagoge, which is just his introduction, is what it's called, but it's basically logic. It's Aristotelian logic, and it was used as a logic textbook by both the Arabs and the medievals. But that's one of the other things Porphyry is known for, is he wrote an important medieval textbook on logic, basically, when people didn't get it straight from posterior analytics, which is incredibly dense, right? They got it from Porphyry. The other important Porphyry text that people for a long time didn't know was Porphyry, and the first person to really figure out that was probably Porphyry was Aquinas, was the Book of Causes. This is a Neoplatonic paraphrase of elements of Plotinus that is, talking about the principles of how one thing causes another or doesn't in metaphysical terms. And this was very important both for the medieval Islamic thinkers, especially Avicenna, and for the scholastics at the time of Aquinas and so on. So anyway, the point is that some of these things passed into important curricula of philosophy East and West, not necessarily under Porphyry's own name, and not necessarily because it was Porphyry, but because this is a very useful treatise on logic. This is a very useful treatise on metaphysics. Everybody reads them who wants to understand those things. Okay, that's Porphyry. After Porphyry comes Iamblichus. He's 245 to 325, so overlapping with Porphyry. Porphyry's only 10 years older than him at the start of his life, but he lives longer, so he's 20 years older at their deaths. He was born in Syria and he worked at Antioch, probably of Arab abstraction. He was a scion of a family that was one of the basically Roman client rulers of interior Syria, away from the coast of Syria, I mean. A family of those rulers. But he's a Neoplatonic philosopher. He disagrees with Porphyry in part because he is a Pythagorean, Neo-Pythagorean. He's much more credulous about stories of wonder working and magic. And this is probably his single most famous book on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. Basically, he thinks that he can collect kind of like the Hermetica, collect the traditions of all the ancient religions of the ancient Near East and show that they already knew all these things about ancient metaphysics and reinterpret their myths, just like the Pythagoreans would find, some mystical insight in the name of Apollo, right? He will go and do that for all of the things which are known in Egypt and Babylon and Assyria. And there's some truth to that in the sense that there definitely are metaphysical speculations in those mythologies. And he is going to try to bring them out. Okay, so part of this is a game of my traditions are older than yours, because at that time, having an early date for an insight was a proof of its truth. And you get that with Josephus will try to claim, of course, Plato was right about and agreed with Judaism because he learned it from Moses, right? Moses came before him, wrote down important things. When he was in Egypt, Plato studied the knowledge of religion of the Egyptians, and they already knew about this stuff from Moses because common traditions. And so Plato and Judaism agree because Plato learned from Moses, right? That's Josephus' way of putting these things together. My Moses tradition is older than your Platonic tradition, so when they agree, it's because my guys put it there, not your guys put it there, right? This is a move that everybody's playing. We see it later with Dionysius the Areopagite, claiming in the 4th century. Well, he's writing in the 4th century, but he's claiming to be the teachings of a 1st century person who was converted by one of the apostles, right? So in Athens. Okay, so I'm just pointing out that this finding ancient wisdom and backdating things was a common trope among all the parties at the time, and maybe even more so among the pagans, because the pagans, as they were arguing against Gnostics and Eastern sects like the Manichaeans and Christians, were always trying to say, we don't have as much to learn from these new traditions as you think, because the ancient pagan traditions already know all this stuff, right? And the last thing they're doing is saying the ancient pagan traditions are true because they were secular and didn't know anything about the divine. No. They're saying the ancient pagan traditions were true because we already knew all about the divine, and here's the truth about the divine, right? So that's the kind of thing you get in Iamblichus. Iamblichus broke with Porphyry over the question of theurgy, of whether or not there was any philosophical merit to ritual practice in these things. And in that debate, Porphyry was the rationalist slash mystic slash it only matters what you think, and Iamblichus was no, the magical, it matters what you do, sort of ritual aspect of things, and that goes along with his Neo-Pythagoreanism. One of the things he famously wrote was the Pythagorean way of life. Basically, his great sage is Pythagoras, and he's going to paint you a picture of Pythagoras 800 years after he actually lived, explaining that he was the holy man and wonder worker who knew the correct way to live, right? And had esoteric insight and was a font of magic and so on, right? So all of the wonder working that you would get in the Gnostics or the Christians, Iamblichus wants the Neoplatonists to have that too, but they don't have it in the form of Plato. They have it in the form of Pythagoras. And of course, Plato is right about all these things because he was a student of Pythagoras, right? Just as Josephus thinks that Plato was a student of Moses and claims him that way, Iamblichus will claim Plato as a student of Pythagoras. Okay, so that's Iamblichus, who's like just after Porphyry and his contemporary. And that's sort of where the split between pre-theurgy mysticism and post-theurgy semi-magical Neoplatonism really happens. Iamblichus is the second side of that split. So that's why she brings up theurgy when she goes to that second chapter. She says, she mentions that there's something else going on here, and you can't just talk about this without realizing that at some point this becomes a matter of practice and magic, right, for some of these people. And that's Iamblichus that she's specifically thinking of there. Okay, not Porphyry. Then we get to Proclus. There's a gap of almost 100 years between Iamblichus and Proclus. Proclus is the 400s, dies in 485. He was born in Constantinople, but worked at Athens until the schools there were closed down pretty much. And most of his stuff is given as commentaries on Plato. The commentary on the Parmenides is one of the examples. This is basically her source for most of chapter 6. And he wrote on the theology of Plato and so forth. But the characteristic thing that Proclus is doing is, properly interpreted, Plato has the answers to theological and divine questions no less than to philosophical questions. That's claim 1. So he's a Platonist in that sense. But he's also an assimilationist who's going to claim that all the things in Aristotle that are right are Platonic because Aristotle was a student of Plato himself. He doesn't see the differences, disagreements between Aristotle and Plato as significant or central. He assimilates the two to one another. And he's creating a kind of united front of pagan, both philosophy and myth and religion, all of them together as the classic traditional wisdom of the ancient world. And he's not seeing division in it. He's not seeing Plato and Aristotle as being against religious traditions. They're bringing out what's true in the religious traditions, and the mythological traditions. You're not seeing a distinction between Plato and Aristotle. They're assimilated, with Plato the more important and Aristotle kind of read in a Platonist way. So, but all of this is also happening in a cultural moment where Christianity is now more in the ascendant, and this pagan position is becoming a minority position, right? Although people like Julian the Apostate and so forth are part of the same idea of trying to make something closer to a religion / ideology / philosophical worldview position, whatever, out of a unified paganism. And that's where Proclus is. The other people he winds up debating against are people like John Philoponus. They have a big debate on the eternity of the world, where Proclus is saying all the ancient philosophers agree with all the ancient mysticism that the world is eternal. It doesn't really have a beginning in time. John Philoponus is like, no, Plato teaches the world has a beginning in time, and Aristotle teaches that the world is eternal, and they do not agree with each other. And he's not having this assimilationist position of pretending that they're the same position on that. The Aristotelian is the world is eternal rationalist who thinks that creation out of nothing is an absurdity, right? And therefore he argues for the eternity of the world, whereas Plato is the philosopher who agrees with the Christians that the world can have a beginning in time. And by the way, Philoponus, being a Christian philosopher, agrees with Plato on the point. So Philoponus is going to claim that Plato agrees with him and the Christians and doesn't agree with Aristotle and Proclus, and that Proclus is falsifying Plato to try to make him agree with the rest of the pagans. Anyway, the point is that besides his position in Neoplatonism that we're kind of getting here, Proclus is also a kind of cultural figure in the Christian pagan fight going on in his time. And he's fighting a rearguard action of pagan conservatism, if I can put it that way, that is becoming more and more a minority position. Okay, so that's the long sweep of all this. And remember, all of this is happening, 600 years, Plotinus himself is happening 600 years after Plato. So, and the whole span of what I just talked about covers 300 years. And 300 years from a time when Christianity is alive but persecuted and is contemporary with Gnosticism, to a time when Christianity is the established church of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it is classical paganism that's on the decline. Okay, any questions about that history before we get into any of the actual stuff in our book? I see a lot of nodding, but no questions.
No question. I thank you very much for that timeline. I like those things very much.
Good. One of the things that's interesting to me is how these guys are kind of they show you the sort of variety of that part of that ancient Roman world, right? They're coming from its different areas and going to its principal centers. Its principal centers are Rome, Athens, Antioch, Alexandria, right? But they're trying to assimilate traditions from as far away as, ancient Egypt and ancient Babylon. Okay, but at least for the first half of them, notably philosophically. I'll just make a couple other points about just how these guys read. Plotinus reads like a philosopher. He reads like a Platonic philosopher. Because it's not his own writings, it's the Enneads that are put together by Porphyry. It's sort of more systematic and treatise-like than a Platonic dialogue, but it's recognizably Platonic argumentation, right? It is trying to establish itself as plausible to any Stoic or something like that. It is giving you the reasons why you should believe in the existence of something like soul and why you should believe in the existence of something like mind. It considers mind higher than soul, all those sorts of traditional things in Plato. He's not just taking for granted as you've already granted them because you read Plato and he can just start from them. He is instead arguing for them in an atmosphere of just expecting you to come at it with your common sense understandings of things, and he has to convince you of every point he's going to use. Right? In that sense, he feels like a philosopher, arguing philosophically, even if the conclusions he's coming to are these highfalutin metaphysical things, and a highfalutin medical system is where he's going, and the end of that highfalutin medical system might be that the highest principle cannot be comprehended by the human mind, and some kind of mystical experience gives more final insight, right? So regardless of the direction he's going, his manner of arguing, his manner of writing feels very much of a piece with sort of classical philosophy or classical Stoicism or the stuff you'd find in Plutarch or anything like that, right? It's that kind of thing. Porphyry a little bit harder because most of what we have from his fragments or things which are, we only know, like the Isagoge is just on logic, it's too narrow. Book of Causes, we don't know how edited that is because the version of the Book of Causes we have definitely passed through many hands, and the version of what we have was, a compendium put together by an Arab author, probably from the time of Al-Kindi, who was editing some Porphyry that was itself a kind of synopsis trying to summarize some bits of Plotinus, right? So it's got many hands on it. It's hard to tell, where's the Porphyry influence specifically here. But that reads like a condensed version of some things you'd get in Aristotle's Metaphysics. He won't be as profuse in giving you all the argumentation for it, but he'll state the principle and then he'll draw some deductions from it. He'll give a short reason or two for it, and that kind of reasoning was very common in the scholastics in the Middle Ages or in someone like Avicenna. So that's the kind of reasoning you find in Porphyry. Iamblichus, on the other hand, has this definite sort of magical character. He's trying to convince you that the ancients knew stuff, and Pythagoras is supposed to convince you of his doctrines by the holiness of his life. And there's all these other, and there's wonder working stories and so on. It's much more this somewhere between a gospel story and the Hermetica in terms of how it argues, right? This is a secret revelation from on high of the mysteries that can teach you the way to be and act and do and know in the world or something like that. So way less philosophical seeming than the people we've just been talking about. Proclus has plenty of points of agreement with Iamblichus, but he reads like a very verbose, systematic philosopher. He reads like a cross between a Plotinus and an Aquinas, something like that. That is, he'll give very long arguments about why he thinks this particular thing on this particular point. The places where he comes out, he thinks of as he's not claiming the original. He's claiming all these things are the doctrines of Plato correctly understood, right? But are also the truth. So presenting himself as a commentator on Plato and a systematizer of Plato and Plotinus and learning from them, but so he's a systematic thinker, but he's not as a tight reasoner, right? He's often willing to give you an argument that is an appeal to an authority or a text, or is explaining an authority or a text. in actual controversy, when someone contradicts his points, like when he's fighting with Philoponus, he has a tendency to only be able to state his doctrine, show that it, he thinks it makes everything fit, and then just assume everyone's going to agree with it. And if they don't, descend to abuse or citation of authority or ridicule, right? He doesn't argue well when actually contradicted, right? So he gives these very systematic treatises that he expects to bowl the other person over with all of its argumentation. But if he meets someone with enough backbone to just stand up to and deny an essential point to his argument so that his argument collapses if he doesn't defend it, he just gets mad, and he's not a good debater. He'll consider that, a profanation of something holy, that his holy texture of argument about a holy topic is not being taken nearly as seriously as it should be by some mere controversialist, right? And that's sort of the vibe you get from him, of a kind of touchy, defensive, systematic thinker who, if you remove one stone from his edifice, it's not like he will defend the edifice or explain to you why that stone followed logically from the stones below it that he based it upon. He will just, abuse you as a know-nothing. So Proclus comes across as not nearly as philosophic as Plotinus for that reason. He's very, he goes on in a very long-winded way, but his reasoning doesn't seem as tight as Plotinus. He's not appealing to you to judge the argument his way. He expects you to be bowled over or impressed by all the authorities he has mustered and all the things he has neatly decided for you, and by the justice and majesty of his conclusions or something like that. And if you're not the kind of right-thinking person who agrees with all that, then so much the worse for you. Okay, that's just, I wanted to give you, besides just going through this history of all these people, give you some sense of what it's like to read them, and the kind of impression they make on you. Because of all that, of these people, to me, Plotinus is the most impressive. The most impressive for the quality of his philosophical thought. Proclus is definitely an extremely energetic thinker. He's done a lot of stuff, and he's worth reading, but you have to pay attention to where his arguments are slippery or loose or don't go through. You probably should do that with Plotinus too, or anybody, but you have to pay even more attention to it in the case of Proclus, because he's much more likely to tell you something which is not true and think that he can just astound you with his reasons for believing it, and have that be sufficient. Welcome, Chuck. We just got through my capsule history of Neoplatonism and what it's like to read these people. Can't go back over it, but we are recording, so you can go back to that if you want. I want to give you a chance, though, since everybody else did, to tell us if you managed to do the reading. I think the prior experience question we already know the answer to. These are new to you. And any first impressions?
I do confess that I did not finish the readings. I only got through chapter 5.
Okay.
And by the time I was done with chapter 5, I was sufficiently boggled and confused and concerned that I must be missing whole dimensions of this.
Okay.
I, in the middle of that, did go back and double check all the Wikipedia resources on Platonism and Plato and everything,
yes,
sort of semi-related, just to get some general background on this. As I had mentioned in previous apologies, I'm not a philosophy person. And so reading this has been quite a stretch for me.
Yep.
I'm very glad to be enjoying it in a very real sense and benefiting from it. And I'm very glad to have wise insights from both the meetup chairman and the other people who have been involved, who bring different perspectives involved as well. In general, as a Christian convert, of course, obviously, I am mightily impressed that Platonism had such an effect on the emergence of Christianity and Christian orthodoxy. I had no clear understanding of the depth of that. I knew just from my own experience of reading in Christianity itself that the Greek philosophers had had a great deal of impact on the emerging faith. And I've already mentioned in a couple of contexts among Chinese communities that Christianity has only once converted a great civilization, and it happened to be the one in which it was born in the classical world of Greece, Rome, and Judea. And although it has had marginal effects in other great cultural areas, India, China, Japan, and of course, by force, it has conquered Africa and South America. But it really, truly, from what I can tell, well, I guess I shouldn't say that. That's imperialistic in a certain way. It has truly only converted down to the hair roots one great civilization pretty thoroughly. And I think that is very much due to the way in which Greek philosophy interwove with the thinking of Christian theologians, and then the subsequent reasoning of medieval theologians as well. So this has been very rewarding for me, and I very much will listen to this and probably the preceding recordings if you have anything to recommend to me as particularly worthwhile conversations that have occurred in the past.
Good. Okay. I have to ask about the bewilderment part, because I mean, we're about to get into going through the chapters, but bewilderment in chapter 5 is definitely exactly what we're here to talk about and or see if we can straighten out for you. Can you tell me what were the things that were bewildering to you in chapter 5 specifically? This is obviously the stuff on Plotinus for everyone else, but
the difficulty that Plotinus himself had in trying to define the one and in trying to come close to it in certain ways with terms like beauty or good, and then apparently to some extent knowing that those terms were just words and that he was trying to describe something that by definition was ineffable and unapproachable and not comprehensible to the mind. I think he had an honest qualm about proceeding further with how to describe it. I don't know that he would have seen very much of the Gnostic systems by the time that he himself
he did, and he wrote a large book against Gnosticism, so he was well aware of them, but didn't like them very much.
Right, but if he was well aware of them, then I think he probably may have found that, as I did, that Gnostic ideas and notions spun so far afield and in such diverse and, to my mind, strange ways that he might have, I think, shied away from saying too much more than he did try to say about the one.
I don't think that he was, I don't think the Gnostics were ever going to shy him away from saying anything about the one that he thought he could actually say. I think that his criticism of the Gnostics is fundamentally a moral one. He thinks of them as revolutionaries, upsetting the correct understanding of the order of the cosmos, something like that. They're insufficiently virtuous for him, and they have too much of the spirit of rebellion in them, in that they're saying they're for the high God and against the creator of the world, and that's not a distinction that he's going to allow, something like that. But if he thought that he could tell you something positive about the nature of the one, he would tell it to you, and the Gnostics wouldn't prevent him from doing so. he doesn't think he can tell you all that much about the nature of the one. So he will try to tell you what he thinks he can tell you about it. You mentioned at one point that he cannot describe or define it. Those are, describe is just the, the writing version of define. Define is to set limits to something. It's to delimit. It's to give something a definition, is to give its outline, to make it finite, to show its outline or limits. And defining infinities is one of those round squares that is always difficult, to say the least, if not impossible. But you also mentioned that you think that there was no route of approach to the one. And there, I think he disagrees with you. He thinks that it is not possible for the mind to intellectually grasp the one, but he does think that there is an approach to the one. He just thinks that approach to the one uses mind only so far, and then at some point goes beyond what mind can do. But he does not, as some of the other people later in this tradition will claim, say that just because mind can't get you all the way there, it is not possible to get there. He is more optimistic about the ability to achieve unity with the one, or henosis, than most of the other people later in this tradition. That's the kind of thing that leads our author to call him a mystic. Does not think it's not possible to get there. Does say that the way of getting there cannot simply be intellect, because intellect cannot get all the way there. One of the things we want to talk about, though, is how much mind does get you, and how much any of this stuff is actually coming from what mind can get you. Because I think there's quite a bit of that. I'm trying to find this. There's one place where, oh yes, here it is. Page 143, top of the page, end of the first paragraph there. This is after, on page 142, she quotes Plotinus explaining this kind of unity. So we'll read both of these. On 142 first, this is the quote. "It is there that one lets all study go. Up to a point one has been led along and firmly settled in beauty. And as far as this, one thinks that in which one is, but is carried out of it by the surge of the wave of intellect itself and lifted on high by a kind of swell, and sees suddenly, not seeing how, but the vision fills his eyes with light. It does not make him see something else by it, but the light itself is what he sees." That's his description of the epiphany of the one. And then 143, where she's reacting to this, she says, "The lifting of the soul from the relative solidity of the non-concept into the light of the good is something which defies rational analysis. Plotinus himself insists that anyone who has seen the vision will know what he is talking about." She herself does not claim to be one of those people, by the way. And I think that's right. I think that Plotinus is not saying that this is an experience that someone cannot have, or this is an experience that is denied to us. The route to that experience is not simply intellectual. All the preparation for it is intellectual. Okay, so this is just reacting to the comment of, is there no way to the one in Plotinus? In Plotinus, there's the way to the one, and it's even somewhat more treadable, if I can put it that way, than it appears in someone like a Proclus, which is much more mysterious. And I can get into some of what I think the reasons for that are in Plotinus, what I think his actual version of that is, and how it makes a kind of philosophic sense. But that's definitely interpretation and me reading into Plotinus, and for that matter into Plato. And understand that our author, Carabine, is able to report what Plotinus says and understand it outside, so to speak, but she is not able to look away from the things that Plotinus is saying to the things he is saying it about and experiencing them herself directly, except to know that mystics say that happens, something like that, which is a position that she herself is sympathetic to, but does not pretend to have walked. Okay. I think that she's right, though, that this is one of the reasons that it's fair to say that Plotinus is not simply a cold, rational philosopher. He is a religious man of the mystic variety. And I think that's entirely accurate. Okay. That's just a reaction to that first bit of conundrum. Were there other aspects of it besides the fact that he's trying to talk about something which is not simply definable that left you bewildered about the chapter? Is it just the difficulty of talking about something that cannot be talked about, or is it something other than that?
Oh, well, for me, it seemed to be, quote unquote, a leap of faith, to use that phrase, to both, on the one hand, postulate that there is a one, and then to postulate that the good and beauty are integrally in some way relatable to the one. It certainly would be logically possible to postulate that some kind of force or monad or something of that sort exists that caused everything else to come into existence, but one would not necessarily have to give it a qualitative description of beauty or good. And I don't know of having such a thin exposure to Plato and the Platonic tradition before Plotinus, that although I'm sure the good was something that got debated in the Agora in Athens and then in all the other places that Greek philosophers were wont to hang out, but I don't know that the good achieved a philosophical basis in Greek reasoning prior to Plotinus. I'm sort of curious about that. I was introduced in early college studies to the Greek notion of arete as a classic original definition of what is good and proper. And I could understand people like the Greeks having a term like that. I had no idea I'd be introduced to all these other Greek terms later on in life.
Right. So let's first talk about that. So arete is excellence, and it's what gets translated into Latin as virtue, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not agathon, which is good, right? So is the good for man to achieve arete and to be an excellent man, perhaps? In what does the excellence of man consist? You can go read the Nicomachean Ethics and discover that it is contemplation. But why is it contemplation? Because the intellect is what is most divine in us, right? So the excellence that matters most is not the excellence of being a good athlete, or the excellence of being a powerful soldier in war, or the excellence of being a political leader of your city that prevents civil war, or something like that, or enacts justice, or something like that. All of those are lesser forms of virtue, even for Aristotle, than contemplation, because excellence is doing well whatever is the natural act of that thing, and the natural act of the human being is to know. That's what you get in Aristotle. I'm just tying together the excellence idea for you with the good idea. Now, that's not yet fully the Platonic idea of the good, because Aristotle isn't a Platonist in this respect. Plato's notion of the good you get talked about in the Republic, the Philebus, and of beauty in especially Philebus and the Symposium. And they get equated with one another. And then he gives some lecture that is never in any of his published dialogues, but where it's reported to us by others that he gave once in public in Athens, not in the Agora. That was his lecture on the good. And everyone went away confused because they didn't know why he kept talking about mathematics. They were expecting a lecture on morals or excellence or something. And instead they were getting a lecture on the nature of what it means to be definable. And something like fitting appropriate measure. And at the end of this long lecture where he's giving all these examples of fitting appropriate measure, when he was trying to talk about the good, he says, so the good is the one. And it is reported that other than his own students, everyone went away confused, right? They didn't follow. In the Republic, where he's trying to explain what the good is, it's something like appropriateness of measure. And he says that it is older and more powerful than being itself. And that it is in the realm of the intelligibles as the sun is in the realm of the perceptibles, that which makes them understandable. But it is even more than that, because it also gives them their being. So that the intelligibility and even the being of the intelligible things, the more than perceptible things, the mathematical things, if you like, is conferred upon them by something which is something like an appropriateness of measure, which is what is good in them. It is the goodness of them that makes all of them, the goodness of good things that makes the goods good is something like an appropriateness of measure. Okay, that's where good can wind up lining up with beauty. Appropriateness of measure is something like fairness of proportion is something like beauty. That's the first equation. You get that coded up in the Philebus. The place where you get the other important notion of beauty is in the Symposium, where what we're talking about is not the good, where we'll get to talk about the good, but fundamentally we're talking about desire. What does rational mind desire? The formulaic definition of the good, the definition of the good that has no content yet, but it's just the form that it must satisfy, is that which all rational minds that are wise would seek. The sought for by rational minds, the sought for by wisdom, that which wisdom loves. That's something like the idea of beauty. It has to be what actually awakens longing, what actually awakens desire, what actually awakens a heartfelt pain at the sense of lack and a earnest striving toward, right? In order for it to count as the love that motivates. The love that motivates is the intermediary between the human soul or the mind and the good that it seeks. So love is the intermediary between the soul and God, something like that. This is something that's taken over again in Christian doctrine, right? The central role of love, this notion that that there is something which is a highest, which is something like beauty itself, which is something like appropriateness itself, and that this is what wisdom seeks and longs for. All of these notions are running together. There's another important thing going on here, which is the way in which the good acts. The good does not act by standing behind things, pushing them along like a billiard cue. The good acts by being a beckoning beauty in front that drives all things to seek it. It is a teleological causation, right? It is an attractor, right? So that is the way in which the good acts. And what does it act upon? Mind. So standing behind all this is cosmology. Before Plato is the notion that the ruler of the all is mind. You get that in Anaxagoras, teacher of Socrates, right? So there's already this notion that there is some ordering mind-like principle of the world. And then that's before Plato. And then in Plato, you get this attempt to understand human motivation itself with these abstract concepts like a good or a beauty that attracts all wise minds toward itself. Okay. And in none of that is there yet any notion that this thing which is doing that is the Parmenidean one. But it is some notion of appropriateness of measure, having a definition, being intelligible. All those things are kind of equated in Plato. So you have to imagine that there is some principle that confers definite measuredness measuredness on things, without which they would not have a definition and therefore would not be intelligible. Okay, and when I say confers upon, obviously not in the sense of a billiard cue pushing from behind, but in the sense of a metaphysical layers of causation of this thing requires as a substrate that this other thing already be there, and the other thing that is already there is also something that minds seek as they seek to know things.
Magnetism.
Yes, even magnetism is too material for this. But yes, attractor. The notion, the closest you get in modern thinking is something like a minimum principle, right? The fact that there is some constraint that things fall into, or it's not a material causation notion of causation at all. Anyway, all that is just to say what this good and beauty notion is. After the Plato's lecture on the good, right? Most people were confused because they did not see how all of those things equated to or related to anything like the Parmenidean one, because they thought of the one as a Parmenidean idea, not a Platonic idea. They thought of Plato as being about the good, and Parmenides was the guy who was talking about the one. What does the one have to do with the good? Okay, so we have to reconstruct this because nobody knows what Plato said in the Plato's lecture on the good, except for a few extra reports on it. But I can understand why he'd be bringing up things about music and math and definitions and Pythagorean and understandings of things. It's because being intelligible, having definitions, and having an appropriate shape are cognate ideas, right? They're equivalent ideas. And this is also something like the same as saying that there is truth about something. Okay, so there is a realm of the intelligibles, which is the realm of mind and truth, which is the realm of the ideas, if you like. And in all of that, there is an idea of the ideas that is the cause of the intelligibility of the ideas itself, and that's the good. Okay. The claim in the Plato's lecture on the good then would be something like, each of these things is a one, or it isn't an intelligible. To be a one, to have a definition, to be a separate essence, to have essentiality about a thing are equivalent terms. They all have to have oneness about them to be their definition, to be a idea. Okay, so I think that's what the Plato's lecture on the good was doing when it was equating good and one. But that's a reconstruction, that's just me. Joe, question?
Well, this sounds like that problem where one is trying to take a whole set of individual items and somehow talk about a plurality of the items. I mean, something about the singular versus the plural.
Well, that's all just for Plato's original idea of the ideas, or Socrates' original idea of the ideas, right? It's a solution to that problem, but keep going. And
I'm looking, I think I've just heard you describe looking at exactly the same thing when Plato conflates these all excellent ways to measure or to define, and then says they all have one thing in common. Good, yes. Fine, but I wouldn't reify good.
Well, he reifies everything. He's not an Aristotelian who thinks the particulars are the reals. He's a rationalist who thinks that the ideas are the reals. And
we understand.
So why wouldn't he, right? So all he's doing is the same move again within the realm of the ideas that created the realm of the ideas in the first place. The ideas are the rational unity that is the actual generator of the perceptibles. That's just straight Platonism, right? Or straight rationalism for that matter. And by the way, more people in the modern world believe that than you might think. But what's an electron? Seriously, but leaving that aside, right? The same move done on the ideas themselves is what I think he's getting at, that is Plato's getting at, in the idea of the good as being beyond being in the Republic, for example. So I don't think it's hard to, I don't think it's a stretch to say that there is an original Platonism that puts all these ideas together. There's then a question of, is Plotinus's way of putting it together that same Platonic original? Not necessarily, right? I think there are definite differences between the reconstruction I just painted for you and the Plotinian version of this reconstruction, but they're talking about the same thing. Plotinus is trying to do the same kind of reconstruction I just did for you right now, right? He just might do it slightly differently than I would do it. because I'm not Plotinus, right? But he is a Platonic philosopher who is trying to do exactly this kind of thing because it's a natural thing to do with all these little hints dropped here and there by Plato. And with what you know about the Platonic notion about ideas, if you find that fundamental underlying Platonic notion of ideas convincing, as Joe perhaps does not, and as I perhaps do, right? But okay. So now with all that said, let's just jump for a second from that little capsule Plato I gave you, and let's ask what about the capsule Plotinus, right? Plotinus starts from the fact, and he's getting this partly from places like the Sophists, that there's everyone knows that there are the material things of nature, and everybody agrees that those things are real in some manner or another, or at least appear to be, whatever might be behind them. But there is a group of people who thinks that there is more than just that. And the first thing that they think that there is more than just that is the realm of soul or life. They don't think that living things are the same as dead things. They think that there's a principle of soul or life, which is a cause of motion independent of the dead billiard balls bouncing off each other, right? Why do the dead billiard balls bounce, right? Why wouldn't they just pass right through each other like neutrinos, right? So there has to be something which is making them bounce. There has to be some force on them. There has to be some cause of motion in them, whatever. I'm being reductio to illustrate that you need a cause of motion, right? And the cause of motion in Plato is anything which cause a thing to move by itself is what Plato in the Laws calls soul. What you get in Plotinus is that same idea made a principle of life, right? Anything that is life has soul in it. Now, that's not yet enough to say soul in any mystical sense, and it's not yet enough to say soul in any sense that includes human or mind. It's something that is shared with all animals. To be an animal is to be animated, which is to have a soul, right? Same word, right? So the animate world is more than just the physical world, is the first principle that Plotinus is starting from. So there's a principle of life or animation in things, in some things. Okay, next above that, there is the principle of the intelligibles. And this is because he's a Platonist, right? There are intelligibles above the living things. Only some living things have minds, but mind gets into contact with something which is not simply material and not simply alive. Mind gets into contact with eternal truth. Truths of mathematics, for example, but any eternal truth. And a modern might say, but those are abstract. This is not an objection to a Platonist, right? The abstract things are more true than the concrete things. So above the level of the material things is the level of soul, and above the level of soul, there's some level of mind. And mind is a place where we're talking about not just, interior of my thoughts or something in some historical autobiographical sense. We're talking about a capability of something alive to have contact with an eternal truth. And an eternal truth means a truth outside of time about an abstract eternal thing. Okay. So Plotinus is deriving and agreeing with Plato on that derivation of that tower, that there is an intelligible realm beyond the level of the merely ensouled, right? And it is contact with eternal truth that differentiates the level of mind from the level of life. Okay, so that means you now have a level of, and being is the cognate word for this. The Parmenidean version of this is the thinking and being are the same, right? That Parmenidean formula is the formula for this level, where thought and being, the thing thought, are the same, come into correspondence with one another. That correspondence of a true thought about an eternal truth that is because it is unchanging truth, deserves the name being. You have a mind, being, thought level of reality that is above the level of the living, which is above the level of the material. Okay. So far, even an Aristotle would go with him, right? Aristotle would make that the highest level, and would, if he wanted to make a single world mind out of that truth, he would say thought thinking itself is the first cause or something like that. But Plotinus, reading his Plato and seeing that Plato says the good is beyond being, says, I just gave you the whole level of being. What is the level beyond that being that is the cause of intelligibility in that being? Well, that's where Plato put the good. He agrees with him. So he puts a level above the level of being and thinking, which is the level of good and one, which he equates. So his hierarchy is good or one, thinking and being, life or soul, matter. That's his chain of being of those 4 levels. And of that, you can almost leave out of account the matter part. The other 3 hypostases are, one, mind and being beside one another, and then life below that. The first 3 of those, one, and then being and mind and truth, are what the Eastern Orthodox Christian fathers will turn into their Trinity. Basically, I'm telling you that this is the Plotinnian Trinity, is those first 3. Where by the first 3 I mean one or good at the top of it, and below it, mind and being. Okay. But below all that, he puts the level of life or soul, and his soul includes a world soul, because just like some things you can see in Aristotle, and certainly as you get in the Stoics, there's a notion of some principle of motion animating the material cosmos. That's the level of world soul to Plotinus. And it's also the level that later people like Proclus will assimilate to the demiurge, or the creator of the material world. Okay, so that's the actual hierarchy of Plotinus, and why he thinks it, right? He's not just pulling this out of his hat. He's trying to explain the phenomena that led Plato to postulate the existence of the ideas in the first place, that there is a hierarchy above the material of the principles of life and mind or intelligibility. And then as the extra level above that, this cause of the intelligibility of the intelligibles level that we were just talking about, which for him is the level of a mysterious good and one and beauty that is beyond being. Now, the fact that it's beyond being, the fact that it's beyond the level where mind understands eternal truth, means that there's something mysterious about it. There has to be something mysterious about it. The only level that is truly intelligible for Plotinus is that level of mind and being, right? The level below that has so much history and change in it that the things you know about it could run away on you. And the level above it is beyond the tools with which you understand. The only truly intelligible level is the level where being and thinking are the same, at that the level of the being level of eternal truth, something like that. Okay. If all of that is a clear hierarchy in his head that he's navigating and thinking in terms of, and yes, there's spatial metaphor in that whole hierarchy, and you can get into all the ways in which he's, purely thinking conceptually to be thinking this way in the first place. There's absolutely positive, not just negative thought in all of it. Now let's go back and see what she might have been talking about, he might have been talking about on that thing we quoted about his mystic experience, and see what levels, what things he might be referring to there. When he says that there's a point where you let all study go, he's talking about leaving the plane of mind. Up to that point, one has been led along and firmly settled in beauty. And as far as this, one thinks that in which one is. You have to think here, he's not talking about the level of your material being, and he's not talking even on the level of your soul. He's talking on the level of mind, which means that in which one is the truth. Whatever else you are in the realm of truth. Your mind is in the realm of truth. Your mind has contact with the realm of truth. There is a realm of truth bigger than your mind that's something like the sea of all truth, right? And he says, but is carried out of it by the surge of a wave of intellect itself, and lifted on high by a kind of swell, and sees suddenly, not seeing how, but the vision fills his eyes with light. It does not make him see anything else by it, but the light itself of what he sees. So this is trying to see the truthfulness of the truth. This is trying to see what the whole realm of truth as eternal truth has in common. What makes the truths of the eternal truths true? That is the light that is blinding him there. He's trying to see not the individual truths, but the truthfulness that makes them true, right? So in an outside time realm of eternal truth, right, try to see what makes the true things true. And not makes in the sense of pushing from behind, but makes in the sense of metaphysically required for them to be that way, definitionally required for them to be that way. That is what he is talking about when he's talking about whether or not it is possible to have visions of what good or one might mean. Okay. Now, I've just explained it rationally enough that you can understand a sort of rational philosophy or rational metaphysics, how he can get to that starting level. His actual description of what happens after that level is you still your mind, you think about nothing, and you wait for the good to appear. It's not a matter of trying to chase a single thought in that, but you have to be contemplating the realm of eternal truth without focusing on anything within it and letting anything you would focus on go away. Joe.
Isn't that something that you would hear a Zen Buddhist say?
Some of it, absolutely. Yeah. Some of what you'd hear a Taoist say, some of what you hear a Zen Buddhist say. You would certainly hear Master Eckhart and the medieval mystics say exactly this same thing, the medieval Christian mystics. This issue of and by the way, you can even think of that part of it way more rationally, right? The point of this is not to think of yourself as a single little agent here performing an act, but to recognize that you are a part of the truth, right? You are a little fragment or piece of the truth in the divine mind. And to stilly just be that is to stop being you and let the whole truth take you, right? It is being possessed of the whole truth of which you are but a fragment. That is the experience aimed at. So yes, there's lots of other mystics who will speak of those things in that way. This is why he calls it kenosis, becoming one, right? It's not that you become one, it's that the one possesses you. The oneness that is always already in you because of the truth that is in you, right? Just as your being can be there because you're a fragment of being, right? Your truth can be there because you're a fragment of even a truth outside of time, let alone a being within it. Joe?
Yeah, this requires a very distinctive reversal of perspective from what I would label possibly the Dasein approach, where I'm looking out on the world and I'm navigating. Suddenly I'm not there anymore. There are atoms there. And so the metaphor that comes to my mind is, a murmuration of starlings. What I'm talking about?
I know what you're saying, but let's put it in Dasein terms for a second, because the same reversal happens in Heidegger too. In the Dasein view, right, in the Heidegger view, right, he doesn't go to anything like an eternal truth here, but he does go to a being. The reversal in Heidegger's term is from thinking of yourself as the time pilot of your existence to recognizing that you are a site or place in which being happens. Where it's not the you happening that matters, it's the being happening that matters. Right. That is being the communication sounding board being played upon by being. And that's the similar kind of reversal, philosophical reversal in Heidegger. It's just only on the level of being and it remains in time. You get that same thing in the different being metaphysics that aren't yet good metaphysics, where people will speak of becoming one with the universe, right? What they mean by one with the universe is recognizing that they are a piece of being, that being applies to them, and not as something they possess, but as something they are, something which has them, right? And that communing with being, becoming one with everything is the Zen Buddhist way of saying this, right? Become one with everything is everything becoming one with you. That's on the level of being. With Heidegger, it's on the level of a being which has a history to it, so it's even remaining in time. But to these Platonists, right, all of that is happening not just at the level of being, but at the level of truth, which is outside of time. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, this reminds me of the statement that, oh wow, when I die, all my molecules will eventually end up in the stars, and so even I have a few particles of the original body of Einstein in my, well, no, he's too recent, of Buddha in my system circulating. because all your atoms commingle as if atoms are one big universal soup. And
yes, but the question, Joe,
each side is just a little drop of it that was thrown into the.
Yeah, I got it. But the question is, are you atoms? If you're atoms, then where your atoms go matters. But if you're not atoms, then the atoms are irrelevant. I can make a computer. I can make a universal computer out of Tinker Toys. The Tinker Toys are not the computer. The design is the computer, right? Yeah. So in that sense, all of these guys being Platonists, they're focused, even some of the being people are focused on the design. These guys are focused even more on the design. They're focused not on the performance of where Karajan conducts the Berlin Philharmonic to play the Requiem. They're talking about the Requiem, which is often the eternal realm with the mathematical ideas. It's not on the note paper. It's not the performance. It's the eternal Requiem of that actual pattern. And if that's what they think they are, then whether atoms go is a matter of complete indifference. The pattern doesn't go anywhere. It's math. So Plotinus thinks that he is a mind, and that mind is math. It's an eternal pattern. So in that sense, the truth can have him because the most divine part of him is a piece of truth.
He is his own page on the cosmic Wikipedia. And he's there and he's true.
Yes, but the cosmic Wikipedia is like the sheet music of the rather than the music itself, because it's something that you have to have a mind in front of it to translate it, to turn it back into the thing, right? True. But he doesn't want to be a Wikipedia page. He wants to be the God's mind's contemplation of the Wikipedia page, if you want to put it in those terms, right? The God mind thought of you is what he thinks people are. So the God mind thought of you.
Sounds like,
go ahead.
That almost sounds like occasionalism, where everything exists in God's mind and you are too.
Well, everything exists in God's mind is not occasionalism. Occasionalism is about everything happening, but everything as a thought in the mind of God is a much older idea and a much more ecumenical idea. It's the dreams of Vishnu idea in Hinduism, and it's it's any theistic idealism, right? And in this respect, some of the medieval mystics like Meister Eckhart are even more determinately theistic idealists than someone like a Plotinus, where it's unclear how much of this is just a static eternal thing and how much of it is a mind thinkingness. For Meister Eckhart, it's a mind thinkingness. The beings are the thoughts of God, right? But the rest of it, the picture is the same as what you're getting here in Plotinus. So, and some of that comes down to how these different people understand what mind is. They might all agree on this being the level of mind and being, but they have very different theories of mind. Okay, I'm just trying to show that there is a rational philosophical basis or metaphysical basis behind this thought. It's not simply a religious doctrine or made up out of whole cloth. You can ask how coherent those things are or how much they follow from one another. But there's a view which is trying to be rationally consistent behind them. Okay, that leads us to the next question. Many of these things we find in this chapter were meant to be deductions about knowability from a little piece of reasoning we saw off in Plato's Parmenides and has been ramified or critiqued by the various people afterwards. That means that the basis of all of this is something like dialectical reasoning, dialectical thought. Plotinus will insist to you that the dialectic reasoning as mere words is not yet the actual thing. Even the thing which is that the patterns in the words are only a symbol for, the thoughts are not yet the thing that he's trying to think about when you're trying to think about something like the idea of the one. But they would never have come up with any of these deductions. They didn't seem to be unpacking a definition of one, right? They'll tell you can't define the one, but the whole reason they think you can't define the one is because the one is supposed to be simple. That's supposed to be part of its definition. You're supposed to be able to deduce all these things from the concept simple, which is supposed to be part of its definition. Well, maybe that definition isn't consistent, but their only reason for thinking that the one has these incomprehensibilities that you find in the Parmenides is they think that they can think simple of it, because they think simple is in one because one means not many, and simple complex lines up with one and many. Okay, I'm just trying to point out that there is a slippery rational basis to this. They're saying you can't define something, but the reason you can't define it was deduced from a definition of it. That's slippery. That slipperiness gets highlighted in Proclus even more than in Plotinus, but there's already something slippery in deducing the unknowability of the one from the definition of one, including simplicity. Okay. So that's in a way the most striking thing about the chapter is the way in which this dialectical reasoning, it's not that it refutes itself, it's that it tries to lead you from itself out to something that points beyond itself. But it's not fundamentally just the bits of dialectical reasoning that we got from Parmenides that do that. It's not some weird, inconsistency in the definition of one in the Parmenides that has spun out these contradictions, because there's also this whole hierarchies of being, nature of truth doctrine behind it that I've just gone through for you. And I must say that I don't think that Dee always sees that second thing. She always sees the bits of dialectical reasoning out of the Parmenides. She doesn't necessarily always see the contradictions in them. She doesn't always see that hierarchy as something having reasoning behind it. She sees that hierarchy as something which they have doctrines about, and she can see that doctrine as a matter of doxography. She can tell you this person's doctrine has these levels and this person's doctrine has those levels, but she doesn't know why they have those levels. She's not following the reasoning of why those levels are there in the first place. Okay. Questions about any of that before I got on to henosis as the way of the non-concept? So I have to ask, Chuck, is any of this helpful for understanding where all this may be coming from?
Very helpful, very intense. I will probably listen to this lecture 3 times once you send it out. But I wonder, for instance, when the term agathon was used for the good, was that introduced into philosophical usage by Plato or before him?
Well, it meant good before him in common speech, but it being used as a philosophical term designating a metaphysical concept is all Plato. And no one would ever have thought of doing it before they had the notion of the ideas, right? The notion of the ideas is the necessary precursor to thinking that an idea like the good could be any more fundamental than any of the other ideas, right? Socrates invents the ideas themselves, but then the idea of the good as being some super idea is, that's Socrates and Plato and no one before them.
And then after them,
by the way, I should say that's of good, right? Before them, there was the one notion in Parmenides, right? But the good notion is coming straight from Plato and Aristotle. It's original to them. The notion of a one that was an original unity, you find in Parmenides and in the Pythagoreans and plenty of people before Plato. But those people weren't talking about the good, they were talking about the one, or sometimes about being. But it was always one or being before Plato and only becomes good after Plato. Sorry, go ahead.
And if I could sort of take us on a wild goose chase a little bit.
Sure.
To what extent would such considerations in any shape, way, or form have been also a development within Hinduism?
So the closest you get is there are things in Hinduism about justice. There's certainly things about unity. There's certain things about, the metaphysics of, a sort of dreams of Vishnu, thoughts of God kind of thing. But in Hinduism, you don't get a good concept as being critical in any of that. The closest you get is something like a divine justice is not human justice, is more august than human justice, or before anything like human justice. And so your concerns about human justice pale into insignificance before it. That you do get in some in some, I won't say in Hinduism as such, but you get it in Bhagavad Gita, for example. And this takes the form of, you don't have to worry as you got into battle that you were killing all these men because they were already condemned long ago by nature to die, something like that. But so there's a terrible majesty about the metaphysical view of the world, which creates a kind of indifference to the plane of the merely humanly ethical. There's still an ethical at that level. The ethical at that level is something like piety, and humility before that, majesty or something like that. But maybe even knowing yourself as an avatar incarnation of those forces, something like that. But none of that is anything like the beauty-seeking ethical good, if it is an ethical good that you get in Plato. Fine question. I mean, from the standpoint of the different theologies, that to me says there's a similar metaphysics, maybe even a more idealistic metaphysics in that Hinduism, but their theology is a being theology. It's not a good theology, right? It's about being and power and the true root of things or something like that. It's not about a good or an attractor or an end state of things. By the way, I should mention that's one of the other things which starts to come out here is the way in which these terms that you hear in later theology are being involved here. The first and the last, the beginning and the end, right? The first is the one from which all things proceed. The end is that which all things seek, right? The equation of those two is an equation of one and good, because the good is actually the end that all things seek more directly than it is the source from which all things spring. So is the first the same as the last, or I would say there's no last that matters in Hinduism. There's only a first. And the same might be true to a certain degree in Aristotle. Being theologies don't have that teleological directedness to them, even if they line the things up. It's just what is. So anyway, that's the distinction I make between the sort of being theologies and the good theologies. Okay, fine question. I want to go to the stuff starting on page 138, Henosis, or the way she calls it, the way of the non-concept. This is near the end of the section. But this is, she mentions the sheer dread of holding on to nothingness. She mentions how if you cannot have a definition of this thing, we talked a little about this, but this is in what way is this negative theology a mere means? And I think she's right here to present this as all the things that you cannot know about the one are a mere means to letting go of the too prideful attempt to think that you can capture it with a definition, right? So there's something infinite and undefinable about it, and all the negative way, all the things you can say, the good is not this, the good is not that, or the one is not this, or the one is not that, are all means of, as she puts it, intellectual purification. But what is the intellectual purification in the service of? Henosis, becoming one. And the becoming one here is not in the sense of you're becoming integrated with yourself through time or something like, integration of the personality in some Jungian sense or something, although I think there are parallels to this Henosis idea in Jung. But it's more like the one being you. It's to be possessed by the one, right? The oneness that is always already in you being manifest is closer to what we're actually talking about here, because it is not a change in the sense that you were not a piece of the one to begin with. Everything is. It's that you, and in Plotinus, there's even a specific level of this. At the level of your soul, thought that you were something else, right? You thought that you were something other than one. you thought that you were, a particular person born in a particular time, with a particular history, with particular interests as a living thing, right? You think of yourself in this narrow embodied way that is going down and down the chains of being to the most particular thing. It is reversing that fall that the whole kenosis process is about, which is at bottom, shift in perspective everywhere, because it's not changing the fact. The fact to Plotinus is always already there, that every rational mind is already a piece of the one. Just most minds are not conscious of this. That's why he says that it is a way of seeing which all have but few use. Right?
That was the problem, though, that I think she did a disservice the top of 139. This is exactly the point where I had trouble with her switching over to the Greek and totally confusing the hell out of that paragraph when she started into there. So I had to go back to McKenna's translation to find that he says knowing of the good or contact with it is the all important. This we read is the grand learning, the learning we are to understand, not of looking towards it, but attaining first some knowledge of it. We come to this learning by analogies, by abstractions, by our understanding of the subsequents. All of that is derived from the good by the upward steps towards it. And she throws in that Greek and completely lost me at that point.
Yes.
So I had to go find.
She's going to say the word analogy, but she writes it in Greek, so you make sure you can't follow, right? To be maximally confusing, even though all she's saying is the way of analogy, right? The actual
analogy, the way of abstractions, and the learning of the subsequents.
And by subsequence, the point there is the idea in Plotinus is that the one is the cause of all things. So one of the ways that you know the nature of the one is by tracking the footprints of the intelligibility in things, something like that, right? This is the same as we saw in some of the Gnostics, where they talked about can you know the fingerprints of fingerprints of God in creation, right? And they all think the fingerprints of God in creation show that God is the creator is way less than the good God. But we saw in the last chapter where they're talking about the ways in which the rest of the ancient world reacted to the Gnostics and found them scandalous, because the people like the Stoics, or for that matter, Plotinus, think that you can read off characters of the creator from the creation, right? Especially the orderedness of the creation, the intelligibility of the creation, and something like that. So that's one of the things that bothered them about the Gnostics. But this process of reading off from the creation back to creator is what he means by the consequences there, right? So that's looking away from Godhead to creation, or in some cases even history, right? But as you say, the other ones are the way of analogy and the way of abstraction. And what do those mean? By analogy, it's the positive things that you think about God that is like. So this is where God is being called Father and good and beauty and one. All of those are things that you have definitions for things less than God, and you can understand those aspects of God by analogy to those things in the rest of the world. That's sort of the positive. And then the way of abstraction is all of the negative stuff, all of the but not this, but not that, right? So all of those are meant to be semi-mathematical method. If you want to know what a point is, you take a three-dimensional figure and you reduce it to one of its faces, and you reduce that face to one of its sides, and you reduce that sides to one point along it. That's how you come to understand what a point is. You're abstracting away things to get down to the resultant. So that same process can be used on all of these things we've been dialectically reasoning about, to say, oh, but it's not what these words say. It's not as finite as this definition, etc. So what the point of the part that you were saying she should have translated and didn't is Plotinus is describing all of those as ways that we get to our intellectual conception of the one. Our intellectual conception of the one is not yet the one, but it's at least our intellectual conception of it, right?
Yeah, the only struggle I had a little bit was with the sense of subsequence, which I can see easily getting to the sense of the one as the causes, as the bringing about of the subsequence. But when you get into the good, which is more teleological, then you got a little bit of problem of where do the subsequences lead you to something teleological.
Yes, and the subsequence of the one include, because it is capable of teleological causation, that which it attracts minds toward, right? That's a consequence, right? It's not a consequence in the sense of push from behind consequence, but it's a consequence in the sense of caused by. And anything that is achieved because a mind was attracted to something is something the good has caused, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't lead you to the good, because the good is the end, not the beginning.
It does both, because it's both to Plotinus.
Yeah, that's where I was struggling a little bit with it, is the sense in which how the subsequence gets you to a sense of purpose or a sense of teleology.
Right, and one of the points to understand here is when Plotinus says subsequence, he's not thinking even primarily in terms of a forward in time temporal direction of causation. He's thinking primarily of a downward in planes of existence notion of metaphysical causation, of what is supported by what, and what is only subsists in what else, right? So the truth subsists in the good, the living things subsist in the truth, the material things subsist in living things as in their consciousness, something like that, right? And all of those notions of this requires this other level to exist because it only subsists within it. That sort of chain of causation is what he's really getting at with these emanations of levels business, right? And he's calling that causation, he's calling that cause, he's calling that subsequent if something is a lower level in that chain, not because it came after it in time, but because it required the previous level to already exist in order to subsist within it.
So he's staying away from the efficient causation and
yes.
including in a final causation in subsequences. The simplest
yes.
way to look at it, yeah.
Yes,
which is something that is very foreign to us now.
Right, but and for this is all very clear in Plotinus himself, because to Plotinus, the whole realm of where things happen in time is inside the realm of soul, right? The whole material world is inside the realm of soul, and everything outside that realm doesn't have time in it at all.
Yeah,
and that's doctrinaire Platonism. That's the same stuff you get in the Timaeus. But
so in a sense, our modern world is also based only on that little round world.
Yes.
Because all we accept is efficient causation within the material world that we're in now, and we can't look at any other subsequence without moving outside of our culture right now.
The closest you get when people like Descartes say, right, he will want to give you that that in-time world as the whole world of what we experience, and he'll allow that the truths about it, right, might be different, or a deist God, that is some unity of truth over all of it might be different. That's as close as you get. Most of the moderns are, even when they're idealists, are idealists of the human social consciousness variety, right? And it's only inside history, right? But that history happens in a cosmos which was there before there was a single mind to see it. It's not part of their world. Where's the other place you get this? The other place you get this is in some of the truth notions of the logical positivists. I'm thinking of Wittgenstein in particular, who can have this mystical element to it, right? When he says the world is everything that is the case, right? He's not just talking about a world in time. The truths that have logic statements of them they can be dated truths. This was true on this date, but once dated, right, they're true forever, or they're not true. Now, you can still read him in a very nominalist in-time way, and most of the other logical positivists did want to, but I don't think he did. I think that was an element of his allowing for there to be a realm of mathematical truth, including the logical truths that was simply outside time, or in all possible worlds true. But that's the closest you get to anything like this in the sort of later moderns. The German idealists don't have it because they're always talking about history and time. most of the positivists don't have this because most of them are nominalists. And they think of everything thought like as just being, words for abstractions about things, which are, equivalence classes over empirical events or something like that. But a few of the more mathematically inclined among the modern logician set are more Platonist about this than you might imagine. Cantor was, Gregory Chaitin is, to use some modern examples.
Yeah, the word that comes up then is eternal, which has nothing to do with time. It's outside and beyond time.
Yes.
And we don't even use eternal in that sense anymore, to a great extent. But I think the eternal truth of a mathematical formula is something outside of time.
Right, and that's my point. The place where we get closest to it is in philosophy of mathematics, right? The philosophers of mathematics still think that way about the things they're thinking about. And some of the cosmologists will even, have a purely mathematical cosmos like that. You think of the Max Tegmarks of the world. The classic ancient world version of this was when Philoponus was debating with Proclus on the eternity of the world. He says, the historical world, the created world, the material world, time is invented along with it and only lasts as long as it lasts, right? But all of that happens inside, in an appropriate sense, inside time. There's eternity in which there is none of that, but when the material world exists, time also exists because time is one of the aspects of the material world, and that's all. And it's in that sense that the world is created in time, to John Philoponus, right? Which actually sounds remarkably like various current physical theories.
Yeah, Big Bang comes to mind at that point. What happened before the Big Bang?
Well, I mean, the Big Bang happens in a four-dimensional space-time, right? And before that, there isn't a time dimension. So, they don't try to tell you anything outside of that because it wouldn't be physics, because physics is about what happens in space-time, right? But it's still the notion that the physical universe, time happening, are equivalent in their beginning and duration, but still have a beginning, is something you already find in Philoponus, and he will appeal to Plato as agreeing with this, and he also agrees with the Christians in this, and he will, attack Proclus for trying to make Plato into someone who thinks that the world is eternal because he's trying to get him to agree with Aristotle. Anyway, that's just sort of the other sort of background stuff going on here, but I want to still get at the Henosis thing. The Henosis thing is it takes us beyond knowing. There is no wandering from unity. Knowing and the knowable must all be left aside. Every object of knowledge, even the highest, we must pass by. For all that is good is later than this and derives from this, as from the sun all the light of day. So the becoming one has to be a leaving aside of even the intelligible realm. And psychologically, that is a leaving aside. Metaphysically, from his point of view, it is simply the underlying fundament of existence for minds being manifest without the distraction of the overstripping layers, which are only the particulars to which it, particular uses to which it can be put, something like that. And this is related to, as I say, notions of what mind is, right? Mind is some weird thing that has no form but can take on any form, right? And can do so in some way that is one, that unifies those experiences. But this becoming one is formless. It is incompetent to grasp where nothing bounds for it. A sheer dread of holding on to nothingness that slips away, the state is painful. And it seeks relief by retreating from this vagueness to the region of sense where it rests on solid ground. The point being that normally the mind is occupied with a something, and having a something is peacefully quieting for it, right? And to not be holding on onto anything, but only something like a realm of truth emptied of the particular contents, right? He says is painful for us, but it's painful for us not because it isn't there, but because it is contrary to our usual thing, something like that. And this is what he says on 140. And by the way, she occasionally says the soul can do this and the soul can do that, where she's the one putting in the word the soul, and it's not Plotinus saying the soul. He's usually meaning the mind. And she does not realize that the soul and the mind are two distinct terms of art for Plotinus. And she just says the soul whenever she means the Christian soul or the consciousness. If one persists, the soul can wake to another way of seeing, which, says Plotinus, everyone has but few use. It is awakening to the presence of the good, which itself can neither come nor go. It has always been present. Indeed, without the presence of the good, the universe would not exist. It is the soul putting on non-being, which is turned from the presence of the good. The point of that is the soul, in the sense of below the level of mind, has put on non-being, turned away from the good that is always there. This harks back to the Heraclitus, how can they hide from what never sets? And most of this could be said of being, right? Most of this doesn't even need the good part. That the mind always already has being, has always been present. Without it, the universe would not exist. All of that would be true even of being. The good is present everywhere as the giver of being, is not absent to anyone save those not fit to perceive his presence. They always already have the likeness to it to the extent that they are a mind. But if they do not conform to that, if they don't empty the mind, then they cannot see it. The good does not give knowledge himself. He gives something better than knowledge. He gives them rather to be in the same place with him and to lay hold on him as far as they are able. And the point of that is to be in the same place with him. This is the being possessed by the good notion, right? It's not knowing God. It's not laying hold of God even. It's God being with you. That's the mystical claim. Okay. Okay. Now, there's two things I want to point out about Plotinus here. Before we go on to the other Neoplatonists. We've gone through sort of why he thinks a bunch of these things. There's one fundamental principle that you hear over and over in this that's part of explaining why the level of beauty or good must be incomprehensible. And she quotes it as one of his principles, and it is that if something is the cause of something else, it cannot be in the thing of which it is the cause. You cannot predicate X of something if it is the cause of X, right? This is one she mentioned several times and claims that it is like one of his principles, right? Okay. And I think it's fair to say that is one of his principles. Part of the reason that he has the hierarchy and he has all these steps down, he has all these chains of things, is that if A cause is the fundamental cause of B, then he does not want to predicate E of the B level, so to speak. Okay, but we have to ask, is this Platonism? Or is this something which is a distortion of the original idea of the ideas? Okay, take the hardest case. Is it true that beauty as the cause of things which are beautiful is not beautiful? Is justice itself as the cause of just things being just, not just? The point is, when Socrates or Plato invents the idea of the ideas are supposed to be exactly that which is the unified cause of the things that participate in that idea, right? So Plato's notion of the ideas violates this principle, is the point I'm trying to make. The principle that if X is the cause of Y, that you cannot predicate Y of X, right, is a principle that Aristotle might agree with, but Plato, well, if Plato agrees with it, it contradicts the theory of the ideas. It would have to at least be limited to some set of things other than the ideas, because the ideas violate it. I'm trying to point out the way in which part of the reasoning here in Plotinus is based upon a principle which is not a Platonic principle, which is his own principle, which is post-Platonic, right? Okay. You can ask, is the Platonic notion that something like good can be can not only be the cause of other good things being good, but can have goodness predicated of it. But I don't think Plato, if Plato has a problem, Plato doesn't have a problem with that in the sense that Plato certainly does that all the time. It's part of what he thinks. Part of what he thinks is the nature of ideas. So example on page 123. The one as the God and cause of nous must be beyond the supreme majesty of the intellect, for the one cannot itself be what it causes. That's in 123. Now, for one, there might be a reason why it cannot be what it causes, because then it would be two, something like that. But from just the fact that it is what it that A causes B, that therefore A cannot be B, that's not true of any other idea. Beauty is the cause of things being beautiful, can be beautiful. Justice is the cause of things being just, can be just. In doctrinaire Platonism, this principle that if A is the cause of anything else, it cannot be what it causes, is appealing to a kind of material imagination of the cause things coming after the causing thing that is distinct from the notion of the idea. The original notion of idea doesn't include this, A cannot cause B because if B comes after it, then A cannot yet be those things. My point is that there's an appeal to a kind of temporality, or at least ordering of dependence in this principle that is not there in the original Platonic notion of idea. It's in fact violated by the original Platonic notion of idea. Now, maybe you could say it's already there in the Platonic notion of idea because the just things that are just aren't an idea of justice, but they're only some just particular. I think this is very strained. I think that this principle, as stated, as used by Plotinus and is enunciated by Dee, is one of the reasons that God cannot be mind, or God cannot be truth, or the one cannot be on the level of being or intellect, is that it has to be beyond what it causes. It's not at all clear that that's a Platonic idea. It seems to be a post-Platonic idea. Okay. It's very easy to miss this because she just states the principle. She doesn't argue against it. She doesn't give any argument for it. She just treats it as an axiom about how you reason about these things. And there's no question it leads to this hierarchy of levels. Go ahead, Joe.
That almost sounds like there's an influence from Aristotle that's crept in here.
It could be. It could be.
And just not mentioned, maybe sort of just taken for granted and not identified.
It could be. It is. That's very possible. It's also possible that it's trying to keep the level of the ideas on the level of the intelligibles distinctly separate from anything else, which is an instance of them. What we actually find in Plato is this, very kind of amorphous doctrine in this discussed by the Parmenidean stranger and the sophists that lets the greatest kinds intermingle with one another indiscriminately, and but goodness can be predicated of the idea of good, beauty can be predicated of the idea of beauty, it's even the most beautiful thing there is, etc. So Plato everywhere violates this principle of Plotinus, and he has a substitute thing which is kind of amorphous. Is the reason that Plotinus departs from that specific influence of Aristotle, or of Aristotle's criticisms of the ideas? Possibly. It's also possible that it's just a, put it this way, a more material imagination about these levels, thinking about them less logically and thinking instead, if the reason that I say that A is the cause of B is that I think that B subsists in A, then the thing which subsists in it cannot yet, A cannot be in the things it subsists in. So the notion of causation involved here may for Plotinus be something which is so far from the Platonic notion of ideas, it's a different notion of causation, maybe reinforced by the Stoics rather than by and the notion of subsistence, instead of by Aristotle and his criticisms of the ideas. I don't know. What I can say is that it's not a Platonic principle. Plato violates it everywhere. It's as used here, it's being used by a Neoplatonist for Neoplatonic purposes, right? In a hierarchy of understanding of these things, which is otherwise very Platonic, but it doesn't seem to be Platonic. I don't know if Plotinus is the inventor of it, or if it's based upon reactions to criticisms from Aristotle or reactions to criticisms from Stoics. I don't know, but it's striking to me. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is the way in which he ties this into the good part, right? This is this is mostly discussed earlier on 130. And I think that Dee kind of underrates the degree to which the symposium beauty stuff is involved here. But okay, there's an important thing here for later Christian doctrine stuff, especially the stuff about in Aquinas. It gets the foundation of stuff that gets very fought over later as series of grace. It's the question of how the good moves the soul, and to what degree is this the good's act as opposed to the soul's act. This is all in 130, right? Human nature therefore cannot therefore decide to return to the good by its own impetus. The light from the good falls into the soul and awakens desire. The good as Saros gives naturally the love needed for the soul to return to it. There's no need for the one to love the soul, for desire has been implanted within it from the beginning. And she says that means there's no need for Plotinus to construct a doctrine of grace, the supernatural gift of the one. The good draws all things back to it simply by being what it is. But the reality is all the causation here is from the good. And that's exactly what you find in Augustine. Why does this matter? This matters because this notion of how the good acts by attraction, how the longing for the good moves the soul, which goes all the way back to the love causation of the symposium, winds up by this, roundabout series through this stuff in Plotinus and then Aquinas's understanding of how God acts by attracting, and the goodness here is the actor, and the soul is only the acted upon. That winds up being the basis of all the later giant disputes in the Reformation and Counter-Reformation about grace. Is God doing the acting, or is the human being doing the acting? Is there a free will involved in this? Can a free will, resist efficacious grace? All that later theological stuff is founded on this Platonic psychological causation stuff and the way in which it's been related to the acts of the good or of God on the soul. So, and I think that it's clear to me that a huge part of that later controversy is happening because people have imported that principle that came from an earlier psychology, and they're using it in a much later psychology. They have a later psychology of the nature of the consciousness and the nature of will and all that kind of stuff than what is here in what was there in Plato and is still there in Augustine. But definitions about how the good attracts / how God creates goodness in the soul here became just, I can put it this way, they froze into dogmas when their psychology changed out from underneath them. And as frozen into dogmas and their psychology changed out underneath them, they became, obviously there's other things going on in terms of how people understand Paul and so forth and all this, but I remember we read a while ago some stuff about Pascal where we determined that in the time of the Pascal controversy, the Catholic Church wound up condemning doctrines of Augustine as heretical because they reminded them too much of Calvinism. And the reason that happened is because Calvin had copied Aquinas. And the church was like, well, that's not what we think anymore, or something like that. But the thing about which that fight happened, and where that curious thing of the Jansenists being condemned for agreeing with Augustine because they smacked too much of Calvinism, right? This is the point about which they were fighting. It was this question about whether or not it is from God or from the soul that the longing for the good comes. Okay. And I think it's just impossible to understand that giant later controversy without understanding its pre-Christian origins in Platonic psychology, and understanding that those were operative in Augustine when he was writing down the doctrines in question. Okay. Okay, we've talked about kenosis. Why did I bring that up? I brought that up because the other aspect of kenosis is not just the quieting of the mind, it's the longing, right? That the moral longing for goodness and for intellectual unity with God and for understanding God, even if you can't understand God, or for God understanding you, or any of that stuff we talked about in kenosis. All of that is there in Plotinus, and it's there as an ethical doctrine as much as it is a metaphysical doctrine. It's what makes him a religion of piety, not just a metaphysical system, a cold metaphysical system builder, if I can put it that way. Okay, and I would even say, compared to the guys we're going to get to a little bit later, there's more genuine religion in that, in my opinion, than there is in the later Neoplatonists. Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out Plotinus is that there's something funny going on here with infinity. One of the prime reasons that the one is incomprehensible in Plotinus is that it cannot be defined, has no definition, is infinite in that sense. And in Plato, she makes the point that only the level of being can be understood because only things in the level of being have definition. And I think that's fair for how Platonists think about things. But that means that she thinks of anything beyond that level as having, since it's as being without form. And I don't think that that's Plato. I think that's that same principle we were just talking about the can A cause B. If you assume that A cause B principle, then if something is the cause of things having form, it can't have form. And that leads you to the notion that the one is infinite in the sense of without form. Okay, this means that the valuation of infinite flipped from Plato to Plotinus. The finite and the comprehensible was the more divine because the more intelligible in Plato, but the truly transcendent and the infinite are more divine in Plotinus because before the level of being in mind where things have definition is the infinite. And we have to track this infinite business. The infinite is going to grow. Yeah, my point is that I don't think that the notion of the good beyond being in Plato had any particular notion of infinity attached to it. If Plato thought about the infinity, he would think about the infinity as the undetermined, and you think of that as the second part of the dyad, the undetermined dyad, in like a Pythagorean way, and he would think of that as something that came after the one. Infinity and two would go together for Plato, not infinity and one. It would be something like a principle of unlimited differentiation that would lead into a notion of infinity, or not having form. But here we have a not having form, which is infinite, which is at the top of the hierarchy. And that's going to make it much easier for the God of Plotinus to be like the God of the Old Testament. The I am that I am, the infinity of the I am that I am is going to be more assimilable to the infinity of a one that is above being than any finite Platonic notion of a single definable good ever could be, right? The point is that the one has taken on infinity, and that's going to make it much more assimilatable to the Christian or Jewish tradition God. Okay. That's all the stuff I see happening in Plotinus. Questions about that before we go on to the others? I realize we've already gone a long time, but there's still Proclus to do.
I had one sentence that ended up troubling me a lot. Page 141, right in the middle. The perception of the presence of the one is described by Plotinus as a kind of simple intuition, but it is an intuition which is experienced only when the soul has become wholly one with nous. Interestingly enough, I took the footnote there, went back to McKenna on the Enneads, and it didn't seem to say that at all in the original Enneads. And furthermore, there was footnotes in McKenna's translation of previous translations, and none of them seemed to say the same thing either. So I ended up kind of being semi-confused as to which was which.
Okay.
In terms of what they were doing. So it's 208, page 284 in the plotness, in the big thick plotness.
284. Let's go there. Are you on 11, another approach? Is that where you are in plotness?
I'm actually at the end of 10. There's a footnote 11 right up there. After
Certainly
that,
this absolute?
Yeah, certainly this absolute is none of the things of which, yeah.
It's none of the things of which is the source. Its nature is that nothing can be affirmed of it, not existence, not essence, not life. Since it is that which transcends all these, so far we're just negative. But possess yourself of it by the very elimination of being, and you hold a marvel. Thrusting forward to this, attaining and resting in yourself, seek to grasp it more and more, understanding it by that intuitive thrust alone, but knowing its greatness by the beings that follow upon it and exist by its power. So this is what she's talking about the simple intuition, but I agree it's not necessarily, it's called an intuition, but not necessarily a simple one. But the thought which he is saying that is that the concept is arrived at by the elimination of being and then resting in yourself, right? And then the greatness is known by the beings that follow, but the thing itself is not known by the things that follow, but by the elimination of being, that is negatively. So that intuition that she is calling simple, he does not call simple, right?
Right.
But he calls it the elimination of being. So I think you're right that he there does not call it simple. I think that simple has a different meaning for Plotinus. When he's thinking of simple, he's thinking of the fact that no distinctions apply to the one. This is the sort of the original premise of the Parmenides passage for hypothesis deduction, right? Is simple being used there only in the sense that simple is one of the reasons that we know that it is that we can eliminate being from it, because the simplicity premise was the premise of the Parmenides passage that got us to the elimination of being as being not predicable of the one. But that's the only connection I see here. That doesn't make it a simple intuition. Yeah. There's a deduction from the nature of simplicity to being not applying to it. The actual intuition has to be to eliminate being. So yes, you're right that she has misrepresented what he was actually saying there.
I found it also interesting that what it triggered for me was Bernstein's Mass at the beginning of that, to sing God a simple song, for God is the simplest of all, which is the beginning of Bernstein's Mass.
Okay.
And there's an element of simplicity in there, in a sense that pushes towards a sort of complexity that the entire Mass follows onto. So I agree that word simple can be a twister.
Yes, I mean, the other place you find this, by the way, is in Maimonides. Maimonides also makes much of the God simple, but for him, it's God simple almost because it's God being, right? It's the simple idea of being, or the concept of being, even more than cause of being. Whereas here, it's, elimination of being. Now, elimination of being is, if being is itself something like definitiveness, then elimination of being is still something like what other traditions might get at as the idea of being, or being tout court, because they're not Platonists, and so they don't see an idea of being. They see a being without restriction, or a universalization in the all direction, not in the what concept does it contain direction. And in that sense, there's something unlimited about the idea of being in the other traditions, like Maimonides, for example. But do you arrive at a simple concept by the elimination of being? Maybe. You certainly have eliminated all of the distinctions that the being of the individual beings have. Is the result simplicity? Maybe the simplicity of original unity. I think she may see it that way, but he does not directly say that.
Yeah.
I think that's her. I think that's the way she's seeing it. But I think that she's not mystically going there. She's just trying to understand it linguistically, almost, verbally. Now, I think that she's right that Merlin says that this is a mysticism of nous, but it's a mysticism of nous because the level of mind or being is the level in which you can see yourself as participating in truth. But the mystical level for Plotinus comes in when you try to see the cause of that level, or the emptied unity of that level. So yes, nous is the only way to get there, but that nous is the starting point, not the ending point. Right. Okay. Excellent comment. Okay. So I want to very briefly go over the anonymous commentary on the Parmenides. So the thing to understand here is the main commentary on the Parmenides that everyone thinks about is Proclus's commentary on the Parmenides, but there were commentaries on the Parmenides written by other Neoplatonists between Plotinus and Proclus. We're not sure exactly who. Could be Porphyry, probably is Porphyry, but we don't know. That's the only part that she discusses in chapter 6 that isn't Proclus. This is pages 157 to 160. It's very short. But what is she getting at there? The big thing is that, as she puts it, Platonism is moving towards an ever more transcendent conception of the unknowable one. There are elements of what you get there that sound almost Gnostic in a way, but can conceive nothing, ending in silence, right? That's sort of all you get from that little intermediary thing. And I don't want to dwell too much on it because I don't think we know enough about it. It's not a coherent enough thing integrated to the rest of philosophy to make a full position out of it, which is not true of Proclus, right? Okay, so Proclus. There's the negation of the negation. There's the question of the relationship between, ways in which he might have disagreed with Plotinus. There's a few moves that Proclus does, but there's also just the fundamental overall change in conception here. The overall change in conception here is that Proclus is less inclined to lay out for you a way that you can arrive at the understanding of the one, and more concerned with impressing upon you how little you or anyone else can ever know the one, or even Plato could know the one. And at the same time, he's also trying to impress upon you that he has correctly understood Plato and Plotinus and everyone in the tradition before him. So the point is, he's trying to be comprehensive of the tradition before him, and then to issue the injunction, don't think you understand the one you don't, right? That's to me, the fundamental thrust of what Proclus is like. And he's going to ramify that. He's going to ramify that with the doctrine of negation. He's going to ramify that with the doctrine of naming. He's going to relate all this to the limits of discourse and go back to other elements of Plato for that, like the Cratylus. But and this is going to give him a notion of the negative way as a matter of stripping ourselves of even not only of the things we know, but of the pretense of knowledge. And I don't find that in Plotinus. I find in Plotinus a faith that we can arrive at something like at least an experiential form of knowledge of the one. And what I see in Proclus is something more like the summit of the understanding is the humility of knowing that the one is, but you don't know anything about what the one is, right? It's a much more negative outcome, if I can put it that way. It's still the removal of multiplicity that leaves open the apprehension. That's straight Plotinus. There's a place on 180 where she mentions, I see here a great fuss being stirred up by those who think that these negations lead us into a absolute non-existence or something such. Since by reason of the lack of a definition or imagination is not even the definition to grasp onto, blah, blah, blah. And then she immediately goes on to, others express similar thoughts, but that's not what he's going on here. What's the point here? The point is, Proclus is reporting that there are elements of the Neoplatonic school who are not willing to rest satisfied with this empty, all negative notion, right? They're trying to have something more like a definition. This is, by the way, something that Gregory of Nyssa will get into controversies with others about. There are people in the Christian tradition who want to use a definition of the first person of the Trinity, which is the uncreated, and they want this concept of the uncreated to be able to be used to deduce things about the first person of the Godhead in theological debate, something like that. And Gregory of Nyssa is not having it because negative way, we don't know, right? You cannot capture him with a definition kind of arguments. We'll get to that when we get to Gregory of Nyssa, but that's already here. He says, let us then declare it to be not being. What is similar to it is negation, right? So the notion that the highest thing is a not being, not a being, is one of the characteristic things we get in Plotinus that we will see made into even more in Dionysius the Areopagite later, who will say that of all the names of God, the one that is least misleading is nothing, not even not being, but nothing, which you would not see in Plotinus. Plotinus will tell you the least misleading name is the one. Okay. And then, again, she doesn't, on page 182, she gives you the untranslated sige, that's silence. Silence is a logical outcome of rising beyond all affirmation and negation through the negation of the negation. And here's where we talk about the triad of desire, silent understanding, and language, and the triad of the thing, the proceeding out of the thing, and the reversion to the thing. Those little triangles are what become the Hegelian logic three of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So there's elements of that which are anticipated in Proclus. The negation of the negation that you get in Hegel is already here in Proclus. Okay. Yes, so the other point she makes in 184 is that Proclus is also a theurgist and lover of Athena. So what's the point here? He, as this sort of grand unifier of the pagan traditions, Proclus is not going to reject Iambelicus and his theurgy. He's not going to reject the Neo-Pythagoreans and their wonderworking. He's not going to reject the supposed wisdom of the ancient mystical traditions of mythical traditions of Babylon and Egypt and so on, right? All of those are going to be made to proclaim various versions of Platonic negative theology beliefs. And I think that there's no getting around the fact that a bunch of that is distortion. A bunch of that is Proclus seeing agreement, Whig history fashion. These are all the ways in which this person anticipated my ideas. Therefore, these are all the ways in which this guy is right. Pardon me. When in fact, the older tradition thought something quite different and maybe not this sophisticated. Okay, I'm not doing full justice to Proclus because I can tell that we're hitting limits of people's attention and time. But are there things that people wanted to particularly go on in Proclus? Joe might want to, but he's asleep. So Craig, it's up to you. Are there Proclean questions?
The only thing I noticed was the quote on 182. I think you kind of covered that already. There's nothing astonished if wanting to know the ineffable through discourse. One's discourse is led to into the impossible. That resonated definitely with me. That's one of those, I think, traps of thinking too much and leading yourself into a brick wall that I find happens regularly. That's just almost a way of thought.
Yes, I mean, it might
get yourself right into a brick wall.
There might be some people would say, the reason that the Neoplatonists got into this problem was because they did not recognize places where they assumed things in their concepts that they thought were simple that in fact were inconsistent. So of course they were able to derive contradictions from them. And I think it's fair to say that there's some of that going on in the Parmenides, but it's also fair to say there's no chance at all that Plato was not aware of it, right? When he's playing with logical exercises, as long as the Parmenides, to say that he doesn't recognize that some of the assumptions are inconsistent, you know, is belied by the entire dialogue, which is trying to derive contradictions everywhere, right? But the other thing I just want to mention here is there's a definite doctrine going on here in Proclus about the relationship between the things themselves, pure thought about the things, then speech about the things, right? And words. The written words are just images of the speeches. The speeches are just images of the thoughts. The thoughts are images of the things themselves. And sometimes the thing itself in there is not intelligible. That chain can fail at any point, but his claim is that even if it doesn't fail at the earlier points and it gets you all the way to the level of pure intuition, it's still going to fail when thinking about the one. But for other intelligible things, he'll claim that direct intuition is the only way to know, and that the other levels don't. He'll even claim this in mathematics. He'll say if you're trying to understand a mathematical definition of the circle, the speech about the circle cannot tell you, the words about the circle, the drawn circle can't tell you, and even we would say the logical discourse about the circle can't tell you. He has no faith in that either, not being an Aristotelian. The only thing he can tell you is a direct intuition of the thing itself. He's a mathematical intuitionist, right, of the typical modern Platonic realist variety. It's not that you followed allowed things in the syntax in your logical deduction that is ever going to arrive at the truth, right? You have to be semantically looking at the same thing, tracking the meaning and confirming the intuition with your direct seeing of the mathematical object that they're talking about. That's his notion of what the noetic truth level is in the first place. But for these unknowable things about the one, even if you have that pure level of intuition about it, you're still not going to understand it. You're only going to understand your concept of it. And that's the distinction that he puts in to differentiate himself from Plotinus. He's going to claim that all this level that you understand at that pure noetic level is only your concept about it, and it's never the actual thing. So he's leaving a level of slippage between what to Plato would be the purely noetic level, and does it actually refer to the reality of the external thing? And that's very not Platonic of him, right? What I mean by that is the Platonists are the people who have almost ridiculous overconfidence that their concepts and reality coincide, right? And Proclus thinks your concepts and reality don't have to coincide. Your concepts can slip from reality. And in all these highest things, they do, he claims. So he's the same Platonic reasoning scheme as being the noetic level that's the truest level, but that's just about your thoughts. So he's, in a sense, relativized the whole thing to the level of human thoughts. And that's characteristic of Proclus. That makes that it's a lowering of the ambition of the claim. But from Plato's point of view, it would be giving up the heroic insistence that your ideas are the realities, that when you're reasoning about your ideas, you're reasoning about the realities. Proclus is like, no, when you're reasoning about the ideas, you're reasoning about your thoughts about things, not the things, which is something that any modern nominalist would agree with, right? But modern nominalists would never come out with this, mystical theurgist, divine working, justifying myths, metaphysics out of all of it. And Proclus does, and the fact that of all that he can say, this is only what we think about them, that, it never occurs to him that someone's going to say, oh, and just push the whole thing over. If these are only your thoughts about these things, why should I pay attention to them? They're not the things. They're not. There's nothing divine about them, right? They're as relative as your prejudices or something. It never occurs to him that someone would perform that kind of move on his arguments, if we can put it that way. But they're open to them. Anyway, all of this is I'm just trying to confirm to you my own assessment of Proclus, perhaps an unfair one in some ways, that I think he's a lesser thinker than Plotinus. I think that he's a very systematic thinker in the sense of systematic exposition, and he's trying to add clauses to arguments that immunize him against objections of various kinds of which he is aware, but the result seems to me to be less philosophically directly in contact with the original problems, if I can put it that way. They're more constructing a fortress debater's position of a unified ideology, something like that. He is to me the ideological Neoplatonist as opposed to the frank philosophical Neoplatonism you get in Plotinus. But that's my own assessment of him. In part, I'm formed, I must say, by his debates with John Philoponus, where I think John Philoponus just mops the floor with him as an actual matter of argumentation. Okay, we should.
Yeah, she kind of takes the sense I got from her writing on it is that the importance was that he goes only so far as to justify his move over to theurgy. That he really says the rest of it, the nomenclature, that's as far as we're going to get. So let me show you a path of how we can get further.
Yes, but honestly, he doesn't invent any of that. He's just borrowing it from Iamblichus, and he's just trying to keep. That's just an example of trying to assimilate as many pagan traditions as possible and not throw anything away. And I don't think he has any particular strong investment in theurgism. He just thinks that we can have that too, and we can't be outdone by other people having wonder workers or something like that. And it's almost a my ideology can tick off the box of having that kind of thing in it that fits. So no one can say that because we have wonder workers and you do not, we're better. And it's that level of party reasoning to me. Whereas with Plotinus, there's this kind of sincere mysticism of how he's approaching the mystical experience. In Proclus, he'll say, you cannot know these things rationally, which is entirely sound. And then he's going to say, but you might be able to know them theologically or mystically. And his prescriptions there are formulas. He's just citing people. He's saying Iamblichus says you can do this, and Plotinus says you can do that. And there's no evidence that Proclus ever did any of it. Okay. We should talk about what we want to do next. I think we have to do the remaining stuff in 2, but I would like to get through Augustine next time. So the idea is we would do chapters 7, 8, and 9. That's Philo of Alexandria, Gregory of Nyssa, and St. Augustine next time. And that's 80 pages, 90 pages, less than 90 pages, 80 some pages. And that leads to the next question, which is, when is the next time? 3 weeks from now would be the 31st. I don't think it makes sense to do that. We talked about it last time. I'm away on the 24th. So I think the first reasonable time is actually 7th November, a full month away. Is 7th November going to work for people?
As far as I know now.
Okay. I'll check with Jim too, but the assumption should be that we're going to do chapters 7, 8, and 9 on 7 November. Philo is one of the more interesting characters here because he's just a place where you have someone trying to put together the Old Testament Jewish tradition and the Platonic tradition with the allegorical method, and his transcendent God is meant to put all these things together, and you can ask, how coherently that can be done. But he's also the only one of these who's not Christian. And then with Gregory of Nyssa, we basically get the reception of this kind of Neoplatonism into Christian theology in the East. And the next one, chapter 9, we get it in the West with Augustine. And by East and West, I'm primarily thinking in Greek or in Latin, right? Not geographically. But by the way, I mean, to push from that order, I think the dates are actually close to contemporary, but they're not that far apart in time. But we're going to leave Pseudo Dionysus and Scottish Erigena for a 4th and final session. But the next one is where we get I can put it this way, the earlier Christian reception. And just in terms of time, Philo is 1st century. And these other guys are, contemporaries with, well, not much later than Plotinus. They're way earlier than Proclus. when we get to Pseudo-Dionysus, will be at the same time as Proclus, and Scotus Erugina will be out in 850. But these next guys are basically, you know, not much after Plotinus. They're maybe 100 years after Plotinus, but they're well before Proclus. So that's just understanding of the time of the things we're doing next. I think that's it. I'll give people a last comments or questions about next time or things we didn't get to.
I'm looking forward to the recording. This is a dense discussion.
Yeah, I think we got.
Thank you for so much exposition and bringing in the history and explaining the rank ordering of the from you know good to being to.
I think that we got into it pretty deep in the Plotinus stuff. I'm pleased with how we managed to get to the sort of core philosophical things and not just the negative theology things. I don't think we did full justice to Proclus, but that's okay. I mean, it's a big book. We're not always going to be fully at the top of our game on every one of these chapters when we get to it after 3 hours on something else. So Proclus got a little bit shortchanged, but we'll live with it. And it's not like we don't have enough things to do with everybody else.
How close in time is Augustine to Proclus?
He's before him, well before him.
Okay, so Proclus actually came after.
Yes, he's the same time. He's the same time as basically these. Within 10. Proclus dies within either at the same time or within 20 years of when Dionysius, the Areopagite, was probably actually writing.
Right.
So all the guys we're getting next time, in the case of Philoponus, he's 1st century. He's back in the Middle Platonists.
Yeah.
And the other guys are basically 300s, so they're like 100 years after the early Neoplatonists, after Plotinus himself.
Yeah, I'm overly fascinated with timelines, so I'll just look it up separately. Thank you.
Yep. No, it's absolutely useful to get these things, and this is we're in the place where these are overlapping as we start the next one, so it's very much on point. All right, we'll see you guys.
And the only other thing I'll notice, I discovered in the introduction to the Enneads, the chapter on Porphyry, and I'm looking forward to reading that first chapter on Porphyry. That looked like a good chapter of overview that's in there.
Okay, great.
There, so that'll probably help a lot to understand some of the history there too of where Porphyry fit into the picture. I think he does a good job with doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you can get a good sense of Porphyry from the secondaries on that, but I mean, his biggest claim to fame is just that he is a guy who gave us Plotinus as the Enneads, and if he did nothing else, that would make him a major figure, right? Sure. I think the other places that he had his biggest influence was actually in the later Middle Ages, both through the Arabs and directly with things like the Book of Causes stuff. But okay. We'll see you guys on the 7th, and I'll put this up later this evening. It'll probably be a few hours, but it takes a while for it to actually save and then upload and so forth. But thanks everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you.